Chapter 739. The electromagnetic cannon was originally a weapon that used the ampere force generated by the electromagnetic field in the electromagnetic system to accelerate the metal cannonball and fire it. However, Little Magnetic Monster's ultimate skill, the electromagnetic cannon, was different. Electromagnetic cannon. Little Magnetic Monster condenses electricity and fires a cannon-like electric current to attack. It can paralyze the target. To put it simply, the Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon was just a kind of electric magic cannon. However, its power was much greater than discharge, and it had a 100% chance of paralyzing the target, unless the target had the corresponding immunity. Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon was basically a magic-type skill. However, the original concept of the electromagnetic cannon was physical damage. However, since Little Magnetic Monster had the foundation to control a powerful discharge ability and also had a strong analyze ability, it was only a matter of time before it could master the real electromagnetic cannon. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, but Dake was still excited. He injected magic into Spell Cage, Little Magnetic Monster, and looked at it carefully. Website: https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP, card name, Little Magnetic Monster. Type, Elf card. Level, *****. Race, Machine. Attribute, Electric/Steel. Magic, 1100, Attack, 1400, Defense, 500. Ultimate skills, Analyze, Discharge, Electromagnetic Cannon, Magic increased by 100, Attack increased by 200, and a new ultimate skill, Electromagnetic Cannon. However, my defense decreased by 100. I remember that Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon only has a 50% hit rate. If I want to strengthen it, I'm afraid I'll have to add a lock function. And if I want to master the real electromagnetic cannon, I'll have to work on electromagnetic wave. As it was too late, Dake gave up the idea of testing the electromagnetic cannon immediately. He picked up a pen and wrote down his thoughts one by one, preparing to implement them one by one when he was free. For a researcher with many ideas, time was indeed the biggest enemy. After washing up and going to bed, Dake held Little Magnetic Monster in his hands and looked around. Little Magnetic Monster's big eyes moved according to his position, but it was still staring at his eyes. "Look again, I'll eat you up." Dake couldn't help but think of this advertising slogan. Then, he freed his hand and scratched the chin of Little Magnetic Monster. It was hard and cold to the touch, but Little Magnetic Monster was extremely sensitive. It narrowed its eyes into the shape of crescent moons, and the horseshoe-shaped magnet that was not caught spun back and forth, making a screeching sound. After playing with it for a while, tiredness crept into his heart. Dake put Little Magnetic Monster on the bed and crawled under the blanket. The winter was cold. Fortunately, there was always someone at home to warm his bed. Every time he entered, he would feel warm. Little Magnetic Monster, who was lying on the bed, looked at the familiar ceiling and slowly closed his eyes. Magic statues didn't have the problem of how long they could last, but they would also enter a dormant state due to insufficient magic power. That was why they needed to eat. Usually, magic statues ate all kinds of minerals that were rich in magic power, but different magic statues had different diets. Eating randomly would cause irreversible damage to the magic statue's body. High-level magic statues could usually absorb the elements in the air, but the absorption speed was usually very slow. They needed the help of various magic circles and resources. Otherwise, they would generally need a long dormant period to recover their magic power. Some more special magic statues could absorb certain substances and convert them into magic power. Although Dake hadn't tested Little Magnetic Monster in this aspect, he was more or less sure that it could be charged. It wasn't difficult to make a generator with the current magic technology, but this technological route hadn't been developed yet. Even some magisters who were good at using electricity mostly used bioelectricity. They would raise electric magic beasts to generate electricity. Bioelectricity was the main axis of the current technology. Therefore, the right choice for the current era was to equip Little Magnetic Monster with a magic beast that could generate electricity or a magical animal. At the thought of magical animals, Dake suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he went to the mysterious realm to look for magical animals. However, the number of magical animals in the society was gradually increasing. In short, plans often couldn't keep up with changes. This was something that couldn't be helped. 24th of December. As the temperature plummeted, ice crystals hung from the eaves of the castle. Thin sheets of ice formed on the surface of the lake, reflecting the soft light of the rising sun and emitting a faint orange color. The students who had changed into their winter clothes early walked out of the castle and strolled by the lake, their faces filled with faint anticipation. At 6:30 in the morning, Dake opened his eyes and got out of bed, full of energy. Although he had only slept in the wee hours of the previous night, he had unexpectedly slept very deeply. A mere 4 hours of sleep seemed to be equivalent to 8 hours of normal sleep. He didn't feel any soreness at the corners of his eyes. Instead, he felt comfortable all over. He wore plush pajamas and walked to the balcony. He opened the window slightly and felt the coolness of the cold wind blowing in. He couldn't help but squint his eyes and look out the window. Little magnetic monster, with its steel body, wasn't affected by the cold wind at all. It floated on his right shoulder and spun its magnet. Ivan, Son Ivan, and the shape-shifting monsters that had transformed into Son Ivan all opened their sleepy eyes and clustered around his feet. It looked like the years had passed peacefully. Time really flies. Dake looked around and sighed in his heart. It's already the second Christmas. Another year had passed since he suddenly recovered his memories on the stage of the Academy's ceremony. As the veil of the unknown unraveled in front of him, the novelty of arriving for the first time gradually faded away. He became more and more integrated into this world. In the distance, a small red dot entered his field of vision and quickly approached. The little fiend monster, wearing a red Christmas hat and a beloved scarf, flapped its wings and flew over. When it got close, Dake opened the window even faster. He raised his hands and caught the basket that it brought from the cafeteria. Day after day, the basket had changed several times. Although Dake had suggested using an insulated lunchbox, the little fiend monster still preferred the basket, so he could only let it be. All this time, Dake had been eating breakfast alone in the dormitory. He had asked the magic guide fairies to go to the cafeteria as much as possible. It had already become a habit. He carried the basket and returned to the room. The window was closed by the little fiend monster. Suddenly, the cold wind disappeared and the chill quickly disappeared. The little magnetic monster circled around the little fiend monster's head and then flew back to Dake's side. Among the magic guide fairies that lived in the dormitory, it had the best perception of the scabbard. It naturally had a sense of intimacy, but the scabbard only wanted to hang on the Delu beast's body and completely ignored it, so it seemed a little lonely. However, when it carefully observed the little fiend monster, it found that this black guy looked quite similar to itself. They both had the same round head, so it thought that maybe it could be a good relationship with it. Of course, that was just its imagination. It was a little afraid of strangers. Just then, Meow Meow grabbed it and held it in front of its chest. Then, it rubbed its head against the top of its head. Although it didn't feel comfortable, the little magnetic monster still rubbed its head against Meow Meow's palm and showed a fawning expression. On the other side, a few hairy rabbits were surrounding the rabbit grass. They all opened their eyes wide and curiously looked at the pink petals blooming on the rabbit grass head. They twitched their noses and sniffed from time to time. It was quite interesting. Dake took out the newspaper from the basket. The front page of the Great Sage Daily had already turned into a festive red. The headlines were cut in half. One side was the first princess's ingenious idea of holding a Christmas lantern festival in the capital. The other side was the Holy Church's Christmas Massachusetts Christmas Lantern Festival. Dake stretched out his finger and rubbed the picture of the street decorated with lanterns on the newspaper. He couldn't help but recall the Lantern Festival in his previous life. He more or less felt a little melancholy in his heart. However, this melancholy disappeared the moment he opened the Clown Daily. The Clown Daily had also changed its front page to a bright red color, but the first thing that came into view was a clown in a bright red cape. The front page was still filled with all kinds of funny reports, making people laugh. He was in a good mood. After breakfast, he sat down and quietly thought about what he hadn't prepared. Finally, he was sure that everything was in place. He could finally relax completely. He wanted to give himself a break today. But when it came to a break, he didn't know how to rest. At most, he leaned on the deck chair on the balcony and leisurely read books and drink tea. It was the same as Claire. At 8:30, there was a sudden commotion outside the castle. Some voices faintly traveled in. The curious little magical beast flew to the balcony and pulled open the window. The sound waves swept in. Dake stood up and looked over. Someone had summoned a magic fairy above the lake and used a sure-kill skill to thicken the thin layer of ice on the surface of the lake, turning it into a solid layer of ice. Then, the students who were waiting by the lake walked onto the ice one by one and started skating. Dake blinked. For a moment, he wanted to join in. But when he saw that the crowd was increasing, he had the intention to retreat. Not long after, Anna and Luo Si excitedly knocked on the door and came in. They invited him to play on the lake. Thus, Dake didn't hesitate anymore. He called the magic fairies and left the castle. The professors heard the commotion and came. But they just smiled bitterly and raised their heads. They didn't stop them like they usually did. After all, it was Christmas. Of course, there were also worried professors who quietly walked over and added another layer of insurance to the thick ice. As long as the giant magic fairies didn't jump around randomly, there was no need to worry about the ice breaking. Some sharp-eyed students saw through the professor's trick. 1 spread to 10, 10 spread to 100. Even more students knew that the professors had tacitly agreed to what happened today. Thus, they rushed over. When Dake arrived at the lake, the sound of laughter was everywhere. Fortunately, the lake was wide enough. Thus, there wasn't any crowding. He and Luo Si walked side by side and followed behind Anna. After a while, he called Anna back. Then, he used alchemy to create a pair of ice skates with ice blades embedded in them. He performed in front of the two girls. Anna's eyes lit up. She begged him to quickly make another pair. Dake made 2 pairs and gave one to each of them. Then, he taught them how to skate on the ice blades. There were many people skating around, but most of them only had a layer of ice on the bottom of their shoes. There was still a big difference. Anna didn't need to be taught. Once she stepped on the ice skates, she was even smoother than Dake. However, Luo Si's motor skills were very ordinary. With Dake's help, it took her half an hour to stand firm. When she was finally able to stand up, Anna pouted and asked Dake to teach her. Dake had no choice but to put on an act and deal with her with a dark face. At this time, the surrounding junior magicians had already followed suit. In the blink of an eye, the ice skates with ice blades became popular. After a while, some seniors asked the crowd to move aside. Then, they cleared a track on the lake and started a speed skating competition. Doc even saw the figure of senior sister Winnie Scatty. She actually put down her book and turned into an ice fairy, which was a rare sight. After the speed skating competition started, Anna gradually couldn't hold back. She stopped pestering Dake and blended into the crowd in the blink of an eye. Dake continued to slowly skate on the lake with Luo Si. The sunlight reflected off the ice shone on Luo Si's cheeks, reflecting a faint blush. The ice skating craze came and went quickly. After noon, with the sunlight shining on the ice, there were more traces of water on the ice. Only 2 or 3 people were still playing on the ice. And more students, in groups of 3 or 5, poured into Traveler's Street. Today's Traveler's Street naturally had more and more interesting products and activities than before. Dake originally wanted to go back to his dormitory and have a good rest to prepare for tonight's ball and the more anticipated small experiment. However, he couldn't get rid of Anna's pestering. He followed them into Traveler's Street and then wandered around aimlessly. They didn't have any goal in mind. They just went wherever was lively and had a good time. After this, it wasn't until 3 or 4 in the afternoon that the pedestrians on Traveler's Street gradually dispersed. Under Luo Si's urging, Anna was also forced to stop. The 3 of them returned to the castle together. For the girls, from now until midnight, it was wartime. After Dake returned to his dormitory, he took out the dress that he had already prepared from the wardrobe. He first tried it on, then took it off again. He took a bath, washed his hair, and did his hair. The magic guiding fairies also began to follow his example and tidy up their appearance and try on their dresses. Their dresses were all prepared by themselves, so Dake didn't need to worry about them at all. Although they couldn't participate in the evening from the beginning, when it came to the ball, they could freely enter. While the students were looking forward to it, Dake's magic guiding fairies had already been waiting for a long time. In the blink of an eye, it was evening. Chapter 740. The afterglow of the setting sun dyed half of the castle red, and the people's hearts dispelled the cold of winter. The clock on the spiral clock tower was eternally keeping track of time. It was Christmas Eve. With the help of the magical elf, Doc smoothed out the corners of his shirt and put on his bow tie. After thinking for a moment, he threw the rose that was stuck in his chest back into the cup and placed the card bag close to his body. Only then did he relax his brows and try to take 2 steps in the bedroom with a smile. It's time. Go, go. The moon god's soul, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with the enchanted beast, goddess of the heart, and the enchanted beast, god of destruction, urged Dake to go. The 3 of them had exquisite dresses placed beside them. They were waiting for Dake to go out so that they could try them on. Then I'll go first. See you tonight. Dake waved his hand helplessly and walked out the door with his chest puffed out. Last year, he entered the ball hand in hand with Deanna and Luoc, but this year was different. Even if they had to go back to their seats after entering the ball, they still had to show their enthusiasm since they were the ones who invited them to the ball. The 2 of them had already communicated with each other through the door card. They pushed the door open at the same time and walked through the corridor, down the stairs, and met up on the Lover's Bridge. Remember the URL. Vipkanchu. VIP. Because of its location, the bridge between the castles had always been popular with couples. Even outside of the holidays, couples would often meet up on the bridge. And on Christmas Eve, there were even more people like this. Male and female students appeared on both sides of the Lover's Bridge, either intentionally or unintentionally. They gathered in the middle of the bridge and left hand in hand. They walked towards the banquet hall on the 1st floor. When Dake turned from the corridor to the stairs on the 3rd floor of the dorm, the door on the other side opened quietly. Deanna and Luoc, who were dressed to the nines, poked their heads out. Their silky hair cascaded down their shoulders naturally. The 2 of them looked at each other and walked out of the dorm together, closing the door behind them. We're the only ones left tonight, Nana, Luoc said with a sad expression. Just when Deanna was about to say something, her face suddenly changed. She said without mercy, "There's one more." Another pink head popped out from the other side of the corridor. Eudora N. Wei didn't harass Dake during the Christmas period, but she obviously didn't have any intention of giving up. She also noticed the 2 people here, so she nodded silently and walked out of the room. A year had passed, and time had left clear traces on her body. Perhaps because she had noticed Dake's experience, she had been growing her hair since the beginning of the year. Now, she finally had a head of beautiful long hair. The 3 girls with different styles gathered at the staircase. They looked friendly on the surface, but at the same time, they were secretly sizing each other up. Deanna's face was still slightly round, but it was obvious that she had a more outstanding beauty temperament. When she closed her mouth, her eyes under her long eyelashes were as lively as a lake. She, who was already 13 years old this year, finally had a little breakthrough in height. She was taller than Eudora, and it was more obvious. For the Christmas Eve dinner, she chose a different red dress from last year. This fluffy dress, which still had a lot of ruffles, was the color of fire. From her neck to her chest, a large area of whiteness was revealed, and half of her collarbone revealed dimples. Her breasts were stacked on top of each other. This dress that ordinary people couldn't wear at all was just a contrast to her attire. Her skin was as smooth as white jade, and it matched the bright red color very well. Her figure that didn't match her age perfectly supported the curve of her chest. Coupled with the same fiery red rose hair ornament and crystal red dancing shoes, it turned into a dancing flame butterfly. It was enviable. Whether it was Luo Si or Eudora, they felt that they couldn't be as dazzling as her. Both of them had chosen to wear lighter colors for the night as well. Luo Si was wearing a slightly light blue dress that was different from last year's pure white. The style of the dress was almost the same as Diana's. She wore a dark blue rose pattern on her head, and the dancing shoes on her feet were dotted with dim stars. Her skin was also white, but her figure was more slender. The cold tone could better set off her temperament. Tonight, she was slightly taller than Diana. Eudora, on the other hand, was wearing the same light pink dress. Even her lip gloss was extremely light. Walking in the gradually deepening night, there would be a kind of illusion that made people afraid that they would suddenly disappear. But if she stood under the spotlight, she would instantly become the most dazzling existence. But overall, she was still a little delicate. Although her delicate body was easy to push down, if she was too delicate, it would only make people feel more distressed. It was difficult to have other thoughts at the first moment. But this was her strategy tonight. After saving up for so long, she resisted the urge to talk to Dake and send an invitation to the ball. It was as if she had disappeared. It was all for the sake of rushing out at a certain moment tonight and not giving Doc any chance to react before pulling him onto the stage. If she didn't make a sound, she wouldn't be rejected. Tonight's goal was to dance with her no matter what. The most ideal situation was to take the opportunity to hold her hand. Eudora had been planning for a long time. The three girls who were already very familiar with each other walked down the stairs and into the common room. They chose a table and sat down. Then, they began to count the time silently, preparing to go out when it was almost time. Soon after, the twin princesses in luxurious clothes sat opposite them. Anna and Enchi, who were wearing complicated ceremonial clothes and gold and silver pendants, were not uncomfortable at all, as if they were wearing casual clothes. The two of them asked about Dake's whereabouts in a roundabout way and ridiculed Diana vaguely. From time to time, they covered their mouths and chuckled. Diana gradually pulled a long face, and there was more fierceness in her eyes when she glared at the two little princesses. Luo Si hurriedly pressed the back of her hand under the table to prevent her from suddenly pouncing on her and biting her. It wasn't until the two little princesses left under the escort of their fans that Diana pouted and said, "Annoying." Of course, she wasn't really angry. She was just unhappy. Luo Si put her hand under her skirt helplessly and took out a milk candy from the card bag tied to her thigh. After peeling off the candy paper, she stuffed it into Diana's mouth. Diana chewed the milk candy, but she was still angry. Eudora, on the other hand, shrank early. She didn't talk to the two little princesses from beginning to end. In short, she lowered her presence to the minimum. After a while, Aurora walked out of the stairs. After catching a glimpse of the three people, she walked over with small steps. She was very familiar with Diana and Luo Si. After arriving at the academy, she often fed Diana. Luo Si naturally accepted her kindness. However, she wasn't very familiar with Eudora, so the two sides made a brief self-introduction after greeting each other. With her unusually keen sense of smell, Aurora immediately realized that the senior in front of her of the same age was also a great threat. However, both sides had only taken half a step forward. In fact, they couldn't be said to be opponents. Eudora was actually also super sensitive. Her feelings were very similar to Aurora's. In short, for defeated dogs, four cats who wanted to steal a fish naturally gathered together. "I wonder how Dake is now?" they thought at the same time. Lover's Bridge. Dake, who had just walked to the end of the bridge, found that the bridge was already overcrowded. He decisively took out the door card and prepared to inform Senior Panduola to meet at another place. However, as soon as he moved, he suddenly felt like he was being stared at by a ferocious beast. That feeling was extremely terrifying. It was as if he was already in a bloody mouth. As long as he closed it up and down, he would be crushed by the sharp teeth. It was a feeling that arose in an instant. There was no warning, which was even more terrifying. He trembled all over, and he almost subconsciously turned his head back, trying to see the true face of the beast. Then, He felt a slightly cold and soft touch on his lips. Ah! Panduola seemed to be frightened and let out a short scream. Her body, which was leaning forward slightly, instantly straightened up. She covered the side of her face that was quickly turning red with embarrassment. Dake opened his mouth, and his eyes were full of shock. The sense of crisis that was like being stared at by a ferocious beast just now disappeared as if it had never existed. At this time, even if he had already been fooled, he naturally could not say it out loud. Moreover, it was still unclear who had taken advantage of her. Tonight, Panduola Doragon was wearing a black and red lace dress, which was out of the ordinary. Her face, which usually had at most light makeup, had more color on it, making her slightly pale face look even brighter. This was naturally the work of Hephaestus Doragon. Her usual state was to show her paternal lineage. Her long black hair was the standard long and straight black. However, she was different from the slender literary girls with long and straight black hair that often appeared in literary works. Her breadth of mind was so broad that it was difficult to give off the feeling of a literary girl being slender. However, it was the perfect compatibility of these two temperaments that firmly attracted Dake's gaze and made him unable to look away. Although it was a little embarrassing to say it out loud, Panduola's every point was precisely on his strike zone. Humans were ultimately visual animals before they fell in love with someone. Even after they fell in love with someone, matching their appearance was still a bonus. A cold wind blew, and the flow of people surged. Dake Dimming stood at the end of the bridge, staring at her without blinking. Panduola's cheeks couldn't help but blush when he stared at her without moving. However, before she blushed, she wanted to control the situation. She stammered, "Have you seen enough?" "Not enough," Dake said softly. Then, he reached out his white-gloved hand to his dance partner tonight. Panduola also raised her hand and placed her black-veiled hand on his. Their fingers intertwined and gently closed. "Let's go. There's not much time left." The awkwardness of being teased just now was easily overshadowed by her cuteness. Dake Dimming, +1 point. The entrance to the Christmas ball was at 7 o'clock in the evening. However, the students would usually set off from the tower at 6:30 and then enter the castle one after another after strolling around. Luo Boat Broheim was like most of the boys. He wore a neat suit, but his broad shoulders and bulging muscles made his suit look too big. He didn't have a cold temperament at all. He suddenly turned around on his way to the tower and walked towards the only infirmary in the school. On the way, he happened to pass by C. Keat Hurst, who was already a third-year student. He knew that this senior from the Marine Biology Research Department, who had a good relationship with White, should have just come out of the infirmary. Sister Ka-Lien was still in the infirmary at this time. Luo Boat knocked on the door and entered. After getting Sister Ka-Lien's permission, he entered the room. The whisper of conversation that Vogue could hear at the door suddenly disappeared. In the room, there was only Victor, who was half lying down, flipping through a book in boredom. White Gouda was protected in the infirmary with the excuse that he was sick. In order to avoid unnecessary trouble, he could only spend this Christmas in the hospital bed. "Think about it carefully. Every holiday is full of misfortune," White said lightly. His eyes were calm as if he had seen through the world of mortals. Robert glared at him and said in amusement, "Stop putting on an act here. The melancholy faction is already outdated." White smiled and said, "Go to the party. Don't worry about me." Luo Boat immediately pointed at his suit and said, "Do I look like I'm going to stay here and take care of you? Whatever, I see that you're in good spirits, so I won't disturb you." He stood up and rubbed his nose. "I'll come back after the first half." White smiled, "Okay, I'll prepare the chessboard." Luo Boat nodded and left. He knew about Ophelia Bullard, but he didn't delve into the details. After Luo Boat left, Ophelia Bullard reappeared and sighed, "What a good kid." White's mouth twitched, but he didn't refute. In front of adults, even the most mischievous of children would restrain themselves. Of course, he wasn't implying that Luo Boat wasn't a good kid. He was just a little impulsive sometimes, stupid. Well, pure. But no matter how bad his friend's flaws were, it didn't affect their friendship. At most, He just had to carry the burden. As the clock gradually pointed to 7, the crisp sound of bells rang in the castle. Dake and Panduola walked along the castle's corridor to the banquet hall on the first floor. Neither of them were talkative, but when they were together, they always had endless things to talk about. From the joys and sorrows of the past to the current life, and then to the future. They could talk about as much as they wanted. Regardless of the reason why they had initially fallen in love with each other, they now had a good impression of each other on the basis of that. Time shuttled through thousands of words, and it was 7 o'clock. The two walked through the corridor, down the stairs, and arrived in front of the banquet hall. Through the open door, a huge Christmas tree came into view. It was dazzling. 3 more days. It's time to become an ascetic monk. Chapter 741. A glowing elk stood on both sides of the main entrance of the banquet hall. The elks wore red Christmas hats on their heads. Dake walked to the door and took off the Christmas hat of one of the elks. A new hat spun from the top of its head and landed on the elk's head again. He smiled slightly, turned around, and picked up the Christmas hat. He raised his head slightly and put the Christmas hat on Panduola's head with some caution. With a smile on her face, Pandora also took off a Christmas hat and put it on his head. Their gazes met, and they stood in place for a short while before moving away. "Let's go in," Panduola said and hurriedly looked away. "Okay." Dake calmly grabbed her hand and walked into the banquet hall. The two of them looked like they were trying to be brave, but in fact, it was their first time in life. They walked into the hall amidst the crisp and pleasant music of the zither. When they entered, their fingers moved gently and naturally released. They said to each other, "See you later." Finally, they walked to the long tables of their respective schools. 1 second to remember https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP Panduola's footsteps were obviously faster than usual. Dake paused slightly and looked at her back thoughtfully. Suddenly, he grinned and walked to the long table of the aristocrat compound. Then, he met Aurora's gaze. Aurora had obviously left later, but she arrived at the banquet hall first. She was a first-year student, so she naturally sat closest to the door. However, when Dake and Panduola appeared at the door together, she had already caught sight of them. Then, she watched them put on the Christmas hats for each other and walked into the hall hand in hand. Only then did she quietly withdraw her gaze, but in the end, she couldn't help but look up again. "Happy Christmas Eve." Dake waved at Aurora. Aurora suppressed her fluctuating emotions and raised her hand to scratch it. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Dake walked past him and walked towards the second-year seats. Almost all the second-year students of the aristocrat house had arrived, and there weren't many empty seats left. Dake looked around and saw that there was still a seat left between Anna and Luo. However, as soon as he walked in, he noticed that there was a teddy bear holding a lollipop on the seat. His smile froze. "Someone's here," Anna read out in a serious manner. But before Dake could say anything, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She covered her mouth and laughed. That little bear was inexplicably summoned and then inexplicably returned to the card, leaving the seat empty again. Dake opened his mouth, but he still pulled out a chair and sat down. It was hard to accomplish anything if one was too thin-skinned. But as soon as he sat down, Anna asked knowingly, "Where have you been?" "Lover's Bridge." Dake said the wrong answer without thinking. Anna's little face visibly swelled up. She thought that this person was really annoying. He didn't even know how to coax people. But if Dake really lied to coax her, she would be even more unhappy. She couldn't help it. She was unhappy. She was unhappy. She was unhappy. Anna's lips curled up so much that she could hang a sock on them. Luo sat on the other side of Dake. It wasn't convenient to feed her now, so she could only blink at Dake. Dake sighed. He had no choice but to move the plate with the whole cake in front of him. He neatly cut it into 3 portions and gave one to Anna. "Do you want to eat?" "Yes," Anna replied reflexively and puffed up her cheeks again. But when the cake was placed in front of her, she obediently grabbed a fork and started eating. The atmosphere finally relaxed. Well, it wasn't tense in the first place. This year's Christmas party was still lively. The students were talking and laughing. The desserts and black tea on the table were filled with the aroma. The lively music of the piano drove the cheerful mood. The unlit candlesticks were dancing on the staves. Colorful balls of light were floating in the air, shrinking and expanding from time to time. The 4 long tables were covered with dark red tablecloths. There was a small Christmas tree standing at a certain distance. Under the Christmas tree, there were elk pulling sleds and bags full of gifts, but there was no Santa Claus. On the stage in front of them, there were countless gift boxes and ornaments hanging on the huge Christmas tree. A dazzling golden crown, a magic grimoire that emitted magical light, a shining lance, and a set of tarot cards with the Fool as the first card. The 4 iconic items were floating around the Christmas tree. Glowing elves were dancing around the Christmas tree, and sometimes they would laugh like silver bells. Looking up, the brilliant Milky Way was flowing on the ceiling. Countless stars were twinkling, and it was mysterious in its magnificence. In this infinitely expanding festive atmosphere, the elegantly dressed professors finally came in from the back of the stage and took their seats in the teachers' seats. In Shangmalian Academy, there were staff changes every year. This year, there were a few new faces in the teaching team, and a few old faces were missing. But the students only needed to know the professors of each subject and the deans of each department. Dake looked over there and saw Hephaestus Doragon, but there was no Ophelia Bullard. Professor Ryan Hux, who came after Christmas last year, had blended in well. But for some reason, his head, which had regrown long hair, was bald again, and it was rounder than the moon. Professor Lee seemed to be in a good mood. As soon as he sat down, he and Professor Nini began to eat the desserts on the table. Ms. Bella in the library seemed to have a good relationship with Hephaestus. The two sat next to each other and were whispering to each other. Professor Shi Erfu sat in the second seat. Tonight, she was wearing a thick coat and a snow-white scarf around her neck. Her face was cold, which was a sharp contrast to Professor Mitya, who was still wearing a thin purple robe. Professor Cheong-si sat in the back, and on her other side was Professor Huldah Boyd, who had a gloomy face. Professor Thompson, Professor Eric, Professor Bacon, Professor Stephen Harvey. Almost all the professors that could be thought of were here, except for Ka Zaire. Principal A. Erti, are you going to be last again? Luo Si whispered in Dake's ear. Probably. Dake frowned slightly, but he didn't know what to say. These days, although he was focused on making golems, he was not oblivious to what was happening outside. It was a little different from what was planned. Although Professor Shi Erfu made a long-distance report to the principal of Erti, it seemed that he didn't get any constructive advice. This was related to the fact that the principal of Erti wasn't actually in the school. There was a limit to what the doppelganger could do. In this incident, the Duke's Mansion and the Shangmalian Academy had reached a private alliance agreement. Olga and Eve would be the representatives of the Duke's Mansion and cooperate with the Academy until the end of this time. Because of this, the Duke's Mansion also got to share some secret information. For example, Dake had always been curious about the whereabouts of the principal of Erti. In short, she was indeed not in the Academy. The last time she was in the Academy was when the professors found the Heart of God in the underground city. At that time, she went to the underground city with Professor Ka Zaire and saw the Heart of God with her own eyes. Not long after, she left the Academy again, and her destination was the Star Tower. The Star Tower was known as the Holy Land of Astrologers and the Land of Stars. Before the appearance of the Sky City, it was also known as the Highest Place. Regardless of these titles, the Star Tower was the gathering place of the best astrologers in the world. The current master of the Star Tower was one of the most authoritative figures in astrology. Compared to her, Professor Mitya Bartholomew was slightly inferior. In order to see the future clearly, the principal of Erti personally went to the Star Tower to visit the master of the Star Tower, and the result was self-evident. After that, the Shangmalian Academy started the Project Against God. Professor Ka Zaire's small experiment was part of the Project Against God, but it was added after considering Professor Ka Zaire's personal wishes. The underground city of Shangmalian Academy was an inseparable part of the Academy's facilities. In principle, The academy didn't want to risk experiments inside, and they didn't want to mix the secret passage and God together, because no one could predict what would happen. In short, the principal of ARTI was more willing to put the risk outside, and only bring it back when it was safe. Therefore, the real project against God was led by her and carried out by herself. Under the guidance of the master of the Star Tower, she set off towards the north. There was the once collapsed mountain of the gods, Mount Pelopos. The so-called Mount Pelopos was basically the name of Mount Olympus in the original game. It was the extreme point of light, the entrance to heaven, and the place where the gods ruled. Even among the gods, the Empyrean gods were the noblest of them all. Considering that the gods were about to recover, the principal of ARTI originally planned to explore the Mountain of the Gods, Mount Pelopos, and the Land of the Fallen Gods, Silent Plains. However, the master of the Star Tower helped her make the choice. The information sharing stopped here. Although Dake really wanted to know why the principal of ARTI wanted to go to Mount Pelopos, what she found in Mount Pelopos, and how far the exploration in Mount Pelopos had progressed, these were all top-secret information, and even Professor Li, one of the deans of the 4 major departments, didn't know. In short, the principal of ARTI probably wouldn't be able to rush back in a short time. Regarding her exploration in Mount Pelopos, if it wasn't a breakthrough, then it was an unprecedented predicament. Professor Shi Erfu didn't mention a word, and others couldn't guess. Therefore, at tonight's Christmas party, it was likely that the principal of ARTI's clone could only appear. As for whether her clone was considered principal of ARTI, for the majority of students who didn't know, perhaps it was. Duang, not long after the professors took their seats, the 7 o'clock bell rang from the direction of the spiral clock tower. The first-year students looked curiously in the direction of the bell, while the students of the higher years were already prepared. The lights in the entire auditorium were instantly extinguished after the bell rang. The light disappeared, and the darkness was terrifying, and the panic was naturally only limited to the first-year students. There was such a scene at the Christmas party every year. Who knew which professor's bad taste came from? Dake squinted slightly and silently counted to 3. He saw the silver candlesticks floating in the air light up together. The halos of the candles instantly connected, illuminating the entire auditorium. Light and shadow quickly intertwined. The atmosphere of the Shang Malian Academy's banquet gradually emerged. The desserts and tea on the table silently disappeared, and rows of gold and silver cutlery quietly appeared. The light of the candles shone on the gold and silver cutlery, refracting a faint, colorful light. The most beautiful and noble lady of the Shang Malian Academy, Cynthia St. ARTI, quietly appeared on the stage while the students' attention was attracted by the cutlery on the table. She raised her staff and gently waved it. The cries of elk suddenly sounded from afar, and then quickly approached. The sky lit up with bright stars. The starlight only arrived after the sound was heard. The snow-white reindeer pulling the sleigh ran out of the starlight, and a bearded Santa Claus sat on the sleigh. The bottom of the gift bag on his back had starlight flowing out, forming a long tail. It appeared from the other side of the stage, and circled around the spacious auditorium. Then, it knocked open the door amidst the cries of the elk, and disappeared into the night with a long tail. The stars flowing from the bottom of the gift bag sprinkled on the plates, and turned into countless delicacies. This was Santa Claus's gift, the source of tonight's joy. Among the countless delicacies, in front of almost everyone, there was a fat and tender turkey with rich meat. The turkey's belly was facing up, and the fragrant ingredients overflowed from the incision on its belly. The turkey's grease on the surface of the turkey slid onto the plates, making people drool. The excited students couldn't help but pick up their knives and forks, eager to enjoy the delicious food that only came once a year. Today is Christmas Eve. Principal ARTI's voice sounded. It's a day to reunite with your family. But for me, Shang Malian is my home. Every student here is my family, Wang Chong said. Every Christmas Eve, I will make a wish that I can spend the next Christmas Eve with my family. It seems that my wish from last year has come true again. Sure enough, it's a wish that is made every Christmas Eve. It's exactly the same as last year's speech. Dake picked up his knife and fork, and silently complained. There were many people in the auditorium who had the same thought as him, but they all tacitly stayed silent. Because Principal Artei's speech was about to come to an end. Why did he have to go to the trouble of exposing her? The children of Shang Malian Academy were always so gentle. I wish you all a peaceful Christmas Eve. No matter when or where, peace will be with you, my dear family. Principal Artei opened his arms, as if he wanted to embrace the entire academy, and gave the final speech. Then, the piano in the corner of the stage played automatically, and tonight's Christmas banquet began as usual. The students could finally pick up their knives and forks, and eat heartily. Dake paid attention to the growth of gluttony, while enjoying the delicious taste of the turkey. From time to time, he would fill Anna's glass with juice, so that she wouldn't choke because she ate too quickly. Dinner lasted for almost half an hour, and finally, the stage was ready for the performance. Last year, the opening was a magic circus, followed by the surprise appearance of the famous singer, the mermaid Miss Seymour, and then the ballet, Swan Lake. The wonderful Swan Lake left a deep impression on the audience, and they could still remember it clearly even today. Dake looked at the stage with slight anticipation. He knew that this year's opening performance was a dance drama, The Green-Eyed Girl, which was produced by the National Duel Club. This dance drama was written for the purpose of selling cards, and it was being performed at various parties in the kingdom at almost the same time. The club had put in a lot of effort to advertise it all over the country. The main character of the dance drama was based on the hippocampus people, and it included elements of a simulated duel. However, it didn't involve the specific rules of a simulated duel, and the duels in the dance drama were mostly about showing off the powerful elves. The first half of the dance drama was about the main character's persistence and restraint towards the green-eyed white dragon card. The second half of the dance drama was about the green eyes turning into a human, and it depicted a touching love story. Although the dance drama wasn't as perfect as Swan Lake, it was still a new show that had never been seen before, and the audience, who were tired of watching old shows, couldn't stop praising it. Dake watched the entire dance drama without blinking, and he knew that the National Duel Club's marketing was in the bag. After the performance of The Green-Eyed Girl, the stage returned to normal, and it was time for the ball. 9:00 p.m. sharp. The highly anticipated first half of the Christmas ball had begun. Wow! Anna bit off the bone of the lamb chop and swallowed it whole. She looked at the person next to her like a thief. Dake shook his head and wiped the grease off the corner of her mouth with a wet towel. Then he whispered, "I'm leaving now. See you in the second half." "Oh." Anna replied and continued to eat. She almost buried her whole face into the small mountain of lamb chop. Her cheeks were red, and it spread to her ears, as if she was on fire. Dake stood up silently. Luosi moved over and sat next to Anna. He winked at Dake and said, "Mine." Dark smiled, then raised his head to look in the direction of the 5th grade. Panduola Doragon put down the mouthwash and pushed away the chair under everyone's gaze. She stood up gracefully. Even though she was surrounded by everyone's formal attire, she was still the most dazzling flower. The two of them no longer hid their intimacy. The 5th grade students already knew that this white dragon girl, who was once known as the Iron Wall of the Ball, had already been conquered by this little junior. At last year's Christmas ball, it was these two who stepped on the stage and opened the curtains for the ball. Some people were unhappy about this and cursed in their hearts about Shotaikon. They looked at Panduola with eyes full of jealousy. They wished that they were the Shotaikon. However, Dake Dimming was already 13 years old. During the war, he was considered an adult at the age of 14. He was already old enough to step onto the battlefield. Although his body was not fully grown yet, he was already more than 7 meters tall. He could be considered as a part of a Shota. Perhaps the only thing left was his young and handsome face. Not long after, the Golden Boy and Jade Girl met up below the stage. Panduola turned her head and looked at the young man whose shoulders were now at the same level as her. She could not help but smile from the bottom of her heart. Last year he was not this tall. She did not expect that in just 1 or 2 years, he would catch up to her. However, She was a mixed blood dragon after all. Her puberty period was longer than that of a normal person. There was still room for growth in the next few years. The more she thought about it, the happier she became. Female dragons would not yield to people who were weaker than them. She believed that Dake would surpass her one day, whether it was in height or other aspects. When that time came, a faint blush appeared on Panduola's cheeks. Her shyness made everyone envious. "Hey!" Dake was staring at the senior's face with rapt attention. Suddenly, there was a loud shout beside him. He frowned and turned around. He saw Anna and Enchi, who he could not tell who was who, squinting at him like a pair of perverted eyes. "Good evening, Dake," said Anna. "Good evening, Dake," said Enchi. The two little princesses' voices were obviously up to no good. Dake sighed in his heart. He turned around and bowed. "Good evening, my lovely princesses. Your faces are as bright as the stars, and your hearts are as deep as the Milky Way." "Thank you." Anna smiled. "Are you calling me evil?" Enchi stepped on Dake's foot. Dake pulled his foot back and stepped on her foot. He looked down at her and said, "All right, Enchi. Happy Christmas Eve. I prepared a Christmas present for you." "Huh? Of course, I prepared something for you too." Enchi's eyes widened. Her face was red with anger. "Then I'm looking forward to it." Dake smiled. He held Panduola's arm and stepped onto the stage. Enchi immediately pulled her foot back and looked at Anna. The twin princesses nodded in tacit understanding and walked onto the stage. As they walked, their lips moved, and the magic cards hidden in their sleeves lit up, and a faint aura enveloped their bodies. The two of them had been planning for this day for a long time. Dake and Panduola attracted a lot of attention, but the twin princesses were not inferior. As the accompaniment started, Dake and Panduola started to dance. The two little princesses did the same. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. Chapter 742. What's going on? Why didn't it work on him again? Anna and Enchi whispered as they danced in circles. They didn't do much. They just made 2 magic cards that could make people feel dizzy. They wanted to mess up Dake's dance and embarrass him. Originally, they had succeeded the first time, and the two of them were quite happy. But after that, they didn't succeed again, and their smiles gradually disappeared. Anna couldn't help but say angrily, "Damn it, are we too kind? If we knew that his mental fortitude was so strong, we would have made him a mental fortitude hammer." And Chi complained, "Don't be like that. We still have to stay in this lousy academy for 5.5 years. "That's true." Anna sighed. People had to lower their heads when they were under someone else's roof. Dake was considered half a professor in this academy. They were quite clear about the current situation. At most, they would try to touch the tiger's skin, but they wouldn't dare to touch the tiger's balls. If it weren't for the fact that a certain someone didn't even take the initiative to invite the princesses to dance with him, they wouldn't have hurried over to make this magic card as revenge. Damn it, since the conspiracy didn't work out, we can't do it openly. And Chi rolled her eyes and said, "I think that Senior Sister White Dragon's dance steps are still stiff. She probably doesn't dance often. How about we work a little harder and suppress her?" "That's right, steal her limelight." Anna's eyes lit up. She said cheerfully, "It's time to show them what real dancing skills are." The two little princesses instantly reached an agreement. Then, their temperaments changed, and they started to dance magnificently on the stage. As princesses, they had been learning all kinds of banquet skills since they were young. Of course, their dancing skills were far superior to Dake and Panduola. Therefore, their strategy wasn't wrong at all. What was wrong was that they were going in the wrong direction. Dake didn't want to attract attention at all. So what if they stole his limelight? It could even be said that he would be happier if they could draw all the attention away from him. In that case, he would be able to immerse himself in the world of two people with Panduola. After that, one song after another, the crowd on the stage changed again and again. Anna and Angie relied on their exquisite dancing skills to attract the attention of the crowd like a whirlpool. They quickly occupied the center of the stage and became the brightest stars under the spotlight. However, they did not realize that the two of them had become powerful assistants. When Dake saw the two idiots walking further and further away, he brought Panduola over to the huge Christmas tree. Then, he slowly danced under the Christmas tree, fully enjoying this rare opportunity. This dance lasted for more than half an hour. The two of them were so immersed in each other's gazes that they did not notice the passage of time. However, the music stopped. Although it was only a short break, it allowed the young man and woman who were still unsatisfied to finally regain their senses. Then, they smiled at each other and walked off the stage. He's finally gone. On the other side, Anna and Anchi, who were as tired as dogs, stuck out their tongues and quickly let go of their hands and walked off the stage from the other side. They probably didn't want to dance for a long time. However, the two little princesses' best performance did add a lot of color to tonight's dance. The surrounding teachers and students who were dancing also had a lot of fun. Of course, there were also some little cuties mixed in with the crowd, twisting their butts and spinning in circles. The first half of the dance was from 9 to 10 o'clock. After that, the second half would start at 11 o'clock. Dark's magic elves had sneaked in as early as 7:30 p.m. and sat at the entrance to watch the entire program. After 9 o'clock p.m., they entered openly and blended in with the crowd, not appearing out of place at all. The teachers and students of Shang Malian Academy had long been used to their presence. Many people were even familiar with them and had a very close relationship with them. Some people fed Snorlax monthly votes, some people invited the demon fox to dance, and some people fought to hug the pink furry rabbit that was hugging the tree stump. Well, fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, became the most popular magic elves tonight. There were also many magic elves who were eager to jump to their master's side. However, Dake told them not to disturb them. At least during the first half of the dance, they had to give them some face. Only then did they get precious private space. But in short, the little cuties who received Christmas hats from the elk at the door had a good time. Tonight's banquet would definitely become a beautiful memory in their hearts. And their master, Dake Dimming, walked out of the banquet hall together with Senior Panduola after coming down from the stage. However, they had been dancing for more than half an hour. The nearby place suitable for the two of them to be alone had already been occupied. Even the stone bench that they sat on last year was already occupied. The two of them smiled helplessly and walked further and further away. Slowly, they walked out of the castle and came to the edge of the lake that had already thawed. The curtain of night fell slightly, and the stars were shining along the lake like the Milky Way. However, the wind blowing against their faces was a little cold. It kept them awake at all times and made them unable to immerse themselves in the charming atmosphere. Unknowingly, the two of them walked into the pavilion in the middle of the lake and sat down by the pavilion. The wind quieted down. The young man and young woman's shoulders gradually moved closer to each other, and just like that, there was no more sound. The night was very cold, but people's hearts were always warm. The view of the two of them was pulled away, and their backs were hidden in the darkness. At 10 o'clock sharp, the bell rang, and the song ended. "The first half is over," Dake said softly. Panduola replied lazily, Dake hesitated slightly, but still said, "I prepared a gift." Panduola said, "For Christmas Eve?" Dake said, "For Christmas Day." Panduola said, "Can't there be two?" Dake. Panduola suddenly laughed softly. "All right, I was joking. I also prepared a gift. Let's exchange?" Dake nodded. "Okay." The two of them separated slightly and sat upright. Then, they each took out a gift and placed it on each other's knees. Dake lowered his head slightly and picked up Panduola's Christmas gift. It was a square gift box wrapped in beautiful colored paper. It was a little heavy, but it wasn't heavy. Dake guessed what it would be, and a faint smile appeared on his face. As for the Christmas gift he gave Panduola, although it was also wrapped in colored paper, it was a flat rectangular gift box. Inside, of course, was the magic card that he had meticulously made. Compared to last year's Christmas gift, this magic card wasn't considered precious at all, but the effort he had put into it was 100 times, no, 1,000 times more than last year's gift. "Can I open it now?" Dake asked softly. Panduola's eyes flickered, but she said matter-of-factly, "Since it's a Christmas gift, of course it has to be opened after Christmas." Dake could only suppress the restlessness in his heart, and holding the gift box, he said, "Then wait until after midnight." Although last year's Christmas gift was opened during the dance, the situation was special at that time, so he didn't bring it out to talk about it. Panduola looked at the gift box he gave her, and said softly, "There are still 2 hours before it can be opened." Dake was a little tempted. "How about we?" Panduola said firmly, "No, let's wait." Dake smiled and put away the gift box. Then, the two of them quietly leaned against each other, carefully savoring the passing of time. It was as if the world was alive as long as the other was by their side. On the other side, Anna was fighting with Snorlax for food in the name of conserving energy. Well, it wasn't that bad, after all. There was a lot of delicious food in the banquet hall, and they couldn't finish it all. Luo Si was sitting beside her, and she was also devouring the strawberry cake in front of her little by little. This was the 3rd piece of strawberry cake that she had eaten tonight, and it was already an exception among exceptions. All this time, she had been trying her best to maintain a slender figure. People like Diana, who would never gain weight no matter how much she ate and whose flesh would only grow where it should, would never understand the hardships of ordinary girls like her. She sighed slightly, and put the last strawberry into her mouth. She resisted the desire to continue eating with her strong willpower, and changed the topic. "I don't know what Dake and Doragon are doing now." The words that came out of his mouth made Diana's hand that was holding the knife and fork suddenly stop. Then, as if she was trying to forcefully convince herself, she repeatedly muttered, "Slowly, slowly, slowly." Pfft. Luo Si couldn't help but laugh. The so-called "slowly" was actually a plan that she and Anna had made together. But plans always couldn't keep up with changes. Once Dake and Panduola's relationship really came to fruition, their plan would be stranded halfway, and they wouldn't be able to proceed at all. The only thing they could rely on was Dake Diming's self-control. Fortunately, Dake's self-control was supported by Bliss, and he had been performing well all this time. Luo Si said, "After this year, Panduola will be in the 6th grade. Then, in another year, she will graduate and leave school. At that time, your chance will come. But that will still take a long time." Anna muttered as she swallowed the food in her mouth. She actually preferred to fight head-on. Of course, the premise was that she had a chance of winning. Luo Si comforted her, "During this period, you should work harder and grow a little taller." Anna glanced at her and said angrily, "You're so annoying. You're poking at my sore spot again." Luo Si laughed, "Uncle and Auntie are already so tall, so you'll definitely grow taller too. Maybe one day, you'll suddenly be taller than me. I have to grow taller sooner or later," Anna said, "otherwise, I'll be treated like a child again. So, I have to work harder to eat. The more I eat, the faster I grow." Luo Si, Anna started eating again. When they saw Dake's figure again, it was already the beginning of the second half of the dance. Panduola walked beside Dake, keeping a little distance between them. Then, she watched him walk quickly to the long table of the aristocrat courtyard, and her smile disappeared. She knew that Dake was going to dance with Anna again. Last year, Dake also left the second half of the dance for Anna. Their relationship must be very good. Of course, she could understand, but this time was different from the past, and she was starting to feel a little jealous. But things had already come to this, so she quickly smiled again and slowly followed behind. After being reminded by Luo Si, Anna quickly rinsed her mouth, wiped the corners of her mouth, and stood up shyly. She was not usually like this, but tonight for some reason, she felt very, very shy. Go quickly. Luo Si pushed her quietly from behind. She quickly walked over, but when she stood in front of Dake, she did not know what to say. She just looked hesitant. A hand with a white glove appeared in front of her eyes, and then Dake's voice came, "This lovely lady, may I have the honor of dancing with you?" Of course. Anna nodded hard, raised her hand, and put it in Dake's palm. Dake took her hand and walked to the stage. As they walked, the clock struck 11 o'clock on time, and the second half of the dance began with the sudden sound of the zither. Pairs of men and women in exquisite gowns stepped onto the stage again. The professors, who had left the first half of the dance to the students, also left the stage to enjoy their lost youth. Before Dake stepped onto the stage, he was blocked. Panduola was a distance behind, and she could not help but smile. At this time, she should be more jealous, but when she thought of Dake's embarrassment, she really wanted to laugh. In front of the stage, Victoria was holding Phoenix's hand and standing there like a door god. Moon god Soul, magical beast, goddess of the heart, and magical beast, god of destruction, were 2 meters away, whispering to each other. Fairy Ibu, Death Coffin, Demon Fox, Diru Beast were leaning against the wall. They were all magic elves. But of course, she knew that these magic elves had intelligence close to that of humans. They were definitely not waiting there just to block the way. She turned her gaze, and saw a few other girls who were not at the stairs of the stage, but were also eyeing the stage covetously. These girls purposely avoided the first half, but at the same time, they were aiming for the second half. But they probably did not expect that they would have so many competitors, right? Panduola's gaze turned, and she remembered what Dake had said before. What did he say to me outside? That he had something to do tonight, so he would leave early? After saying that, he didn't tell me what it was. Now he's in trouble, right? After this round, can he still leave early? What should I do? Panduola smiled foolishly, but she realized that the girl with light blonde hair had already walked to her side. Why are you standing here? She asked. Luo Si walked over and wanted to greet her, but at this moment, his expression froze. Panduola exhaled. Shouldn't you be over there? It's the last day of the month. Please vote. My head was smashed by the crab pincers. Save me. Chapter 743. Aren't you supposed to be over there? This sentence drilled into Luo Si's ears like a shuttle. She was instantly stunned. She felt a buzzing sound in her head, and she was stunned. Her current state of mind was like a little rabbit that had been pulled out of a dark hole, or a kitten that had been caught stealing dried fish. She wanted nothing more than to curl up into a ball. However, Panduola was a little surprised when she saw her reaction. She thought to herself, "You're so obvious. Don't tell me you think you're hiding it very well?" Fortunately, her temper had improved a lot after she reunited with Hephaestus, so she didn't expose her too much. Thus she added, "But that's good too. Sitting on the mountain and watching the tigers fight is indeed not a good strategy." Luo Si's head exploded. She immediately came to her senses and hurriedly explained, "Senior, I didn't have that thought." Panduola crossed her arms in front of her chest, her delicate ripples trembling. She smiled and said, I understand. Luo Si's rebuttal came to an abrupt end. Her ears were as red as blood. Panduola took advantage of her stunned state to casually pull her to sit down. She calmly took a brand new tea set from the side and placed the teacups in front of herself and Luo Si. Then, she filled them with a pot of black tea. The fragrance and sweetness of the tea was different from the bitter tea. It seeped into one's heart along with the spiraling green smoke. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP Panduola pulled out a bunch of fruit plates, cakes, puddings, and cookies from the table. Then, she asked Luo Si to eat. Luo Si carefully held the teacup. She was especially cautious. Pan Duola excitedly pointed at the girls below the stage, who were eyeing them covetously. She asked, "What do you think of them?" Luo Si didn't expect her to ask this question. However, due to her guilty conscience after being exposed, she subconsciously followed Pan Duola's train of thought and said, "Very, very good." "What's wrong?" "It's nothing." Pandora chuckled and looked over at her own accord. Those girls were actually very smart, but it was easy to become blind when one fell in love with someone. They knew that they couldn't snatch it in the first half, so they chose to avoid the first half. But he never thought that if he didn't even have the courage to face her head-on, what could he use to fight her? Forget about the girl named Ai Ma. She seemed to have danced with Dake at the Christmas ball last year, but her presence was not strong this year. Pan Duola thought that she had given up struggling, but he did not expect her to still be so stubborn. But that was it. On the other hand, the girl named Eudora had always kept a low profile, but her contact with Dake had become more frequent. Is she finally going to reveal her fangs today? Speaking of which, Anna was the most generous. As the saying goes, the pavilion closest to the water enjoys moonlight first. This child usually looked energetic, but when it came to Bayonet, she became timid. Sure enough, her mental age was still too young. It would take a few more years for her to be a threat. Even Aurora, who was 1 year younger than her, was more threatening than her. That was too much. Pan Duola's smile faded slightly, and her eyebrows were a little dignified. In her opinion, the behavior of these little girls was like a child's game, but Aurora's game was really like a monk's game. Since she got the door card, she often exchanged messages with Dake. Although they rarely met in daily life, the communication time had increased. Therefore, she now knew a lot about Dake's daily situation. Of course, she also knew that Aurora was trying her best to please him every night before feeding him. Although Pan Duola felt that she had a huge advantage now, she was not very good at getting along with people. It was the first time for her to deal with emotional matters. Her mature appearance could not hide the clumsiness in her heart. Many times, she did not know how to deal with it and could not grasp the importance of it. Therefore, she had never said much about Dake accepting Aurora's feeding. And Aurora was a student of the aristocratic academy. And she was from the magic academy. Aurora's actions could be said to be at the right time, the right place, and the right people. At present, it seemed that nothing could stop her. In front. In the end, Dake stood his ground against the opinions of the public. He held Anna's arm and stepped onto the stage. Between Anna and the many magic elves, he chose Anna. It could not be said that the magic elves were not as important as Anna in his heart, but Anna had sent him a formal invitation. He had to consider Anna first. Dake's heart was actually very soft. But when necessary, he could always be tougher than anyone else. Those who were close to him could generally feel that the arrogance and indifference he showed to the outside world was just an act. The softness in his heart made him meticulous, gentle, and elegant. His toughness when necessary made him unusually decisive at critical moments. There was always an indescribable sense of security when being with him. This was where his charm lay. Once someone touched him, they would be firmly attracted to him and would never be willing to let go. Pan Duola looked at the stage. Dake and Anna had already started a circle dance on the stage. Anna was the same as her. She was not good at dancing, but her athletic ability was extremely strong. She learned to dance very quickly, but she still danced very slowly. It was so slow that it was completely inconsistent with her style. Anna's mental age was very young. It was normal for her to be attracted to Dake. But it was actually very difficult to say how much of that feeling was love between a man and a woman, and how much of it was dependence on her father and older brother. Pan Duola judged from the perspective of a bystander. She thought that it was mostly the latter. So even though Anna seemed to be the most proactive, she was not a big threat. She was even worse than Luo Si Flotty, who was beside her. Pan Duola picked up a cookie and stuffed it into her mouth. She had interacted with Luo Si and Anna last year. At that time, Luo-si was far less outgoing than she was now. Luo-si was very insecure. Just like her when she first came to Shang Molian Academy. And a person like Dake who was gentle, considerate, and safe was like a huge magnet to girls like her. He had a natural attraction. What's more, both his external and internal conditions were top-notch. If he did not control it, he was simply a living little girl's harvester. In fact, last year's events had already verified this description. Dake received almost all the first-year girls' invitations to the ball. Therefore, it was very reasonable for Luo-si to like Dake. On this point, Panduola actually felt the same. She would not like an irresponsible man. Panduola continued to look at the golden-haired young man dancing on the stage. As for the girl dancing with the young man, she no longer had any sense of existence in her eyes. Luo-si Flotti was still nervous at this moment. She did not know where she had given herself away. She had never thought about the possibility that she was full of flaws. In a situation where she could not figure it out, she could not help but think about the consequences of her thoughts being exposed. Since Panduola had already seen through it, then, would Dake know? Would Anna know? I can't let Anna know. She did not know why, but this was her first thought. She was even a little flustered. But she did not know what to do. She was just a girl who had spent most of her life in a birdcage. She was an inexperienced girl. What should I do? As the saying goes, when you can see others, others can also see you. Although Ai Ma, Eudora, and Aurora were in different positions, they were actually paying attention to Panduola. Ai Ma's thoughts were actually quite light. She had put on makeup again today. She had learned how to do it herself. What she wanted to do was to wait for Dake to finish dancing and sit down to rest, just like last year. Then, she would disturb him a little and dance a simple song. Then, they would go their separate ways. But this year, even if she deliberately avoided the first half and avoided Panduola, it would be more difficult to achieve her goal in the second half. Because the people lining up were too. Well, there were even more magic elves lining up. This really messed up her rhythm. She did not know if she should be ahead of the group of magic elves or wait until the magic elves had their fun. Then, she would probably have to wait until the end of the ball, right? Her thoughts, which had always been clear, were slightly messed up. Ai Ma was sure that she was not good at dealing with this kind of thing. Eudora, on the other hand, pursed her lips and stared at Dake without blinking. She felt that she was an assassin. The kind that would flee thousands of miles away if she missed. If she mustered up the courage to rush out tonight and was rejected again, she was afraid that she would really have to flee thousands of miles away. She heard that the people on the Star Tower all spoke very nicely. Perhaps she should go and take a look, sad. In short, she was looking for an opportunity now, an opportunity to hit the target with one strike. During this process, she felt that a ferocious beast had been hibernating behind her, which made her hair stand on end. But she withstood the pressure. Good job, Eudora. She cheered herself on and forced herself not to care about the oppressive dragon might. You can do it, Eudora. Aurora's position was slightly behind Eudora and Ai Ma. Before today, she had invaded Dake's dormitory twice with the excuse of delivering supper, but she had failed to hand over the invitation to the ball twice. Of course, it couldn't be because she had forgotten. How could she forget such a thing? It was just that in her heart, there was always some stubbornness and restraint that belonged to a young girl. She hoped that Dake would take the initiative to invite her. So after thinking about it, she didn't make a move on the night of stewing chicken soup. On the second night, she was like a turtle in the end. Her original consideration was that if Dake didn't take the initiative to invite her again, she would compromise, do it herself. However, when it came to the last moment, she stopped again. An idea suddenly emerged in her mind. It was only the second half of the dance. Was there really any meaning to it? Once this idea came out, it was difficult to suppress. She only felt that her plan all along was fake. There was an impenetrable wall between what she wanted and the current situation. The name of the wall was Panduola. Before breaking through this wall, all the sweetness that seemed to be successful was meaningless. It was a poison that corroded the will, a lure that made people learn to compromise. She asked her heart, what did she want? Her heart told her the answer. So in the end, Aurora failed to hand over the carefully prepared invitation to the dance party. Then until now, she was still entangled in the question of whether to go or not. If she went, she always felt like she was rushing to eat the bones thrown by others. If she didn't go, she was afraid that she wouldn't even get the bones. She originally wouldn't be entangled in this kind of problem. But even a girl herself couldn't guess what a girl was thinking. For a moment, she was a little obsessed. The whole situation was much more complicated than Dake expected. But the intricate situation gave him a gap. If after dancing with Deanna, Ai Ma, Eudora, Aurora, and Luo Si appeared at the same time and surrounded him, he was afraid that it would really be difficult for him to choose. As for the current situation, there was only Deanna in front of him for the time being. It was disrespectful to all girls to think about other girls when dancing with the girl he liked. Therefore, he deliberately restrained his thoughts and immersed himself in dancing with Deanna. He had mastered the rhythm that Deanna liked, and from dancing slowly with her rhythm to leading her to a more intense high position, the two gradually developed more tacit understanding, and Deanna also learned more positions. Deanna even felt that it was no big deal to be able to enjoy it so much just by being wrong for a while. But happy times were always short-lived. The end of the song was relatively abrupt for both of them. Deanna hesitated. She didn't want to stop at all. After summing up the experience of last year, she didn't wear thin high heels to make herself more compatible with Dake. The dark red crystal dancing shoes fit her very well. She didn't feel sore at all, and she didn't have to worry about the high heels being broken. She could continue to dance, like Dake and Panduola, for half an hour, or even a whole hour. But she didn't know that Dake couldn't wait any longer. Professor Ka-Zayer wasn't in the banquet hall since the beginning of the evening party. He had been preparing for tonight's experiment since before the evening party. No, he had been preparing for tonight's experiment since yesterday. The day before yesterday was Sunday, the 22nd, and he returned from the underground city. And since that night, Ali had disappeared as well. By the way, 2 new maids came that afternoon. However, the 2 maids didn't come for the underworld's fire extraction experiment, but to hand over the goods. Dake had ordered them at the Duke's mansion, and the gifts for the magical elves were also brought over. And tonight, just before the second half of the dance, Dake returned to the banquet hall and found that Professor Shi Erfu had disappeared. In addition, Sister Ka Lien, Professor Cheong Si, Professor Midi, and Professor Li Li were also missing. As for Principal A. Ertiai's clone, it had been a long time since he last saw it. Since then, among the professors who sneaked into the underground city together, only the innocent-looking Professor Nini was still squatting there and fighting with Snorlax for food, Foggy. Since then, among the deans of the 4 schools, only the current dean of the House of Fools, the professor who taught magical elemental languages, Professor Holdell Boyd, remained. He sat in the corner behind the teachers' seats, and his eagle-like eyes glanced around the entire hall, as if he was trying to catch 108 murderers in this hall. Fortunately, Professor Nini used her huge body to block his gaze, so he could only see a little from the side. That was why he didn't achieve the achievement of Atmosphere Destroyer. Seeing that all the professors were yo-yos, Dake couldn't calm himself down. Even if he couldn't participate in this small experiment led by Professor Ka-Zayer like the other professors, even if he couldn't get involved in this experiment, he still wanted to see the results of the experiment, the moment when the experiment was successful. Such a precious and great moment, he didn't want to miss it no matter what. He couldn't wait to run to the secret passage, to the experiment site. 11:30. He set a time limit for himself in his mind. He had to finish everything before 11:30. He couldn't delay any longer. Dake. Deanna raised her head, and her cute face, which already had the temperament of a beauty, was slightly raised. She stared at Dake with her shy eyes, and her watery eyes were filled with expectation. Dake's heart was in pain, and his footsteps were already in rhythm with the start of the second dance. Ha! Panduola pursed her lips and swallowed the tea in her mouth. She realized that Deanna's threat level had increased by 1. She couldn't cut it, and she couldn't sort it out. Being soft was Dake's strength, but it was also his weakness. There were always two sides to everything. After all, Diana came first. She suddenly heard this sentence in her ear. This made the corners of her eyes tighten, but she didn't turn her head to look. Luo Si suddenly said this sentence out of nowhere. Was it for her, or for himself? Who knew? No one knew. The atmosphere of Christmas Eve was strange and unpredictable. Every dance on Christmas Eve was shortened to between 5 and 6 minutes. In 30 minutes, there were about 5 dances. When the second dance was about to end, Dake finally adopted the tactic of striking first to gain the upper hand. When their footsteps intertwined, and their bodies were close to each other, he whispered in Diana's ear, "Merry Christmas." Christmas isn't here yet. Diana wanted to say this, but she was pulled off the stage by Dake in a daze. 3 more to go. The stage on Christmas Eve seemed to have instantly turned into a duel arena in a race against time. Dake gently let go of Diana's hand and turned to look at the magic elves. Fairy Ibu was already jumping over like a rabbit with a happy face. Carat Omega Carat. It was finally Fairy Ibu's turn. It thought so. But between it and Dake, a hexagram array inlaid with stars and moons suddenly lit up. Eudora, who was part of the cheating trio, suddenly appeared from this array. Then, she pursed her lips tightly and grabbed Dake's hand with a face as red as an apple. Fairy Ibu's face flashed with surprise. Eudora, who had rehearsed alone in the dormitory again and again, lowered her head and looked at her toes. She kept pulling Dake's hand and walking towards the stage. She wouldn't ask. Although it was rude, she wouldn't be rejected if she didn't ask. She knew that Dake wouldn't stay still. She had already thrown caution to the wind. Sure enough, after a pause, Dake followed her strength and walked towards the stage. The prophecy succeeded. She was overjoyed. After walking on the stage, she tripped because she was too hasty. Extreme joy almost turned to sorrow. However, Dake looked at her slender and weak waist that could break at any time in an extremely elegant manner. Her face was as red as a rosy cloud, and her heart was unprecedentedly sweet. She really wanted to melt in his arms on the spot. After that, she didn't remember anything. Although she had practiced in front of the mirror many times, it was actually very difficult to make progress in dancing by herself. In the end, it was Dake who guided her through the entire song. These 5 to 6 minutes were like a dream. She couldn't tell if it was reality or illusion. The dream shone into reality. She was completely drunk. The alarm bell in Panduola Doragon's mind rang. Eudora threat +1. Eudora threat +1. Eudora threat +1. The notifications that kept popping up in her mind made her expression change slightly. She realized that she had underestimated this pink little girl. The most irresistible thing for humans was unrequited love. Eudora's behavior pattern made her, who was actually more rational, too puzzled. She even wondered if there was something wrong with this woman. However, she learned from Dake that not only was Eudora not sick, but she was also talented in astrology. The third dance song quietly ended. Dake led Eudora off the stage and whispered in her ear. Eudora shrank to the side with a red face. Then, she was startled by Diana, who patted her shoulder. Diana didn't bite her. Dake knew that there wasn't enough time. However, he realized that he was no longer in control. Fairy Ibu looked at him angrily. Victoria's little face was puffed up like a meat bun. Ai Ma was already considering whether to leave or not. Aurora stood there, tugging at the corner of her clothes. You have a soft mouth after eating someone's food. Dake sighed. He had no choice but to let his obedient baby suffer and take the initiative to walk towards Aurora. He straightened his expression and tried to show the true colors of the Sea King. Then, he stretched out his hand to Aurora, who had her head lowered. Aurora's mind instantly went blank. She picked up the bone that was thrown by others. No, since Dake took the initiative to invite her, of course, it couldn't be considered as a bone that was thrown by others. She maintained her last reservation and grabbed Dake's hand with a slight tremble. Then, she stepped gracefully onto the stage with him. The second half of the dance had been going on for 20 minutes. More teachers and students rushed onto the stage. Some even jumped directly around the stage. The atmosphere became more and more lively. She and Dake danced a beautiful waltz under the lights. During this period of time, AI Ma keenly discovered that Dake had something to do. So, she glanced at the group of magic elves. After Dake and Eudora walked off the stage, she chose to attack decisively and won a stage victory. She decided to write this decisive victory in her diary. When she walked off the stage with Dake, it was already past 11:30. After all, Dake couldn't stop time. He could only accept this reality. Then, he grabbed Fairy Ibu's ribbon antenna with one hand and Victoria's palm with the other. He was ready to kill them all. Together. After being stuck for a whole day, I finally finished writing. I woke up at 4 o'clock yesterday morning. Now, it's 6 o'clock. I'll sleep for a while and then get up to write the first chapter of March. I need a guaranteed monthly ticket and a guaranteed blade. Chapter 744. Regardless of whether it was Victoria or Evie, they were definitely unwilling to accept his futile plan of wiping them all out. Victoria was fine. She was just here to act like a spoiled child in front of Dake to increase her presence and remind Dake not to forget about her and Phoenix's Christmas present. As for the moon god's soul, it was more like they were there to join in the fun. They wanted to go along with the festive atmosphere and leave behind some memories. The only ones who really wanted to participate in tonight's ball were Fairy Ivan, Demon Fox, Deeru Beast, and the other Bliss magic guiding fairies. Oh, Deeru Beast wasn't one of them. Of course, Demon Fox and Deeru Beast wouldn't be mentioned out loud. The furry rabbits had just arrived and weren't familiar with the place, so they didn't have any ideas. The little dream demon was even more playful and had already caused a ruckus inside and outside the castle. The two little, multi-dragon Baluto especially picked on the couples in the corner and made it seem like Christmas was Halloween, but they didn't get tired of it. The big milk jar had already changed its mindset and had turned Bliss into a motherly type. In the end, the only one who had made up her mind to insist on dancing with Dark was Fairy Evie. But, Fairy Ivan, she still cared about her master. With the intimacy between her and Dake, it had already formed a bond and strengthened the mental connection between the Archmage and the magic guiding fairies. She could already clearly feel her master's thoughts. Website https://m Vipkanchu. VIP. She knew that Dake was very anxious and wanted nothing more than to grow wings and fly out of the banquet hall. Thus, Fairy Ivan, who was good at understanding people, could only suffer a little. At most, when they went to bed at night, she would snuggle in her master's arms and act spoiled in protest. Obedient children get sweets. Thinking this, she obediently held onto Dake's hand. Victoria, on the other hand, had a change of thought and jumped up happily. Thus, Dake waved his hand and brought a group of magic guiding fairies onto the stage. Of course, the Shang Malian Academy's Christmas ball couldn't be as casual as a public square dance, but people would always be open to cute things. Thus, when this group of magic guiding fairies rushed onto the stage, not only did no one feel annoyed, many people even cheered and danced joyfully. Dake first danced 2 rounds with Victoria, then danced a few rounds with Evie, and then the next and the next. The eyes of the magic guide fairies below the stage suddenly lit up when they saw this scene, and they all boarded the dance party and danced around Dake, creating a lively atmosphere. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was stirred up by them. It was less elegant, but more lively. Laughter could be heard endlessly, which was very different from the past. In the blink of an eye, the song came to an end. Dake estimated the time in his heart. In the end, he jumped 2 steps with the Demon Fox Beast and the Deeru Beast and prepared to take advantage of the situation to escape. There was no danger tonight, so there was no need to recall the magic guide fairies back to the card to be on standby. But just as he was about to get off the stage, he suddenly saw the shadow under his feet change. Then, he looked up abruptly, and the laughter stopped in the blink of an eye. With a chuckle, Professor Li had already drilled out from the ceiling, flapping his thin dragonfly-like wings and swooping down. Dake subconsciously raised his hands to catch him, but Professor Lely suddenly stopped and grabbed his hands, then turned around and quickly ran away. "Let's go!" With a call, the wind blew past his ears. The surrounding people who were happily dancing had just reacted when they saw Dake turned into a blurry phantom under the guidance of Professor Lely. That phantom moved quickly, and in a flash, it penetrated the human wall, passed through the huge Christmas tree, and suddenly disappeared behind the scenes. Since then, the figure of the blonde youth had disappeared from the stage. The magic guide fairies who still wanted to pester their master to continue dancing suddenly stopped. But the dance music had just stopped, and it didn't stop because of the disappearance of one person. The popularity of the dance party decreased slightly, but it was still lively. As the midnight approached, more and more students returned from outside, and the slightly reduced popularity quickly recovered. The students and professors of Shangmalian Academy welcomed Christmas with joy. There were two things to talk about. Dake was already used to the fairies' magical ability to pass through walls. In his mind, he no longer thought about, if Professor Lely suddenly stopped and let go, would he be stuck in the wall? And other such terrifying thoughts. As the scenery on both sides quickly passed by, the road ahead also went from flat to upward. In the blink of an eye, he climbed to the second floor, the third floor, and it only returned to flat when he reached the highest floor, the 9th floor. But his speed didn't decrease, and instead increased. He was already like a stream of light. At a certain moment, Dake suddenly felt that there seemed to be a water film floating in front of him, but in an instant, he passed through it, and his vision suddenly changed. He had already entered the secret passage. "Hey, we're here!" When a clear voice sounded in his ears, his feet had landed firmly on the ground. Only then did Doc come back to his senses and scan his surroundings. The secret passage was still a secret passage. The torches on the wall lit up one after another the moment someone entered, and the blazing fire instantly dispelled the darkness that swallowed the world. On the ground, there was a row of bronze braziers that were filled with black liquid. Starting from the end of the secret passage, they extended inwards like a long dragon until they disappeared into the darkness. These braziers were engraved with mural-like patterns. Some of them were the sun, the moon, stars, mountains, rivers, plants, and trees. Some of them were making tools, some were farming, some were soldiers and horses, and some were moving mountains and rivers. The black liquid in the braziers should be some kind of kerosene. Dake quickly digested the huge amount of information that poured into his mind and quickly asked, "Are these ritual tools?" "Obviously." Professor Lely flapped his wings and pointed to the left side of the first bronze brazier. On top of a bronze shelf that was about a meter tall, there was a flat bronze brazier. A torch was placed in the brazier. The torch was made of wood, but when one got close enough, one could smell the bursts of incense. Obviously, this torch was also an extraordinary item. Just looking at these ritual tools at this moment was already a work that took a lot of time and effort, and who knew how many resources were invested into it. Obviously, in a place that Dake didn't know, the huge machine that was the Shangmalian Academy had been operating for a long time. This was just the result of a short period of time. "Has the ritual started?" Dake asked concisely. Professor Lely shook his head and said, "More than half of it is done, but the most important part is still left. Ka Zaire specifically left a spot for you. He said that he wanted you to have a sense of participation." When Dake heard this, he was so moved that tears filled his eyes. "No way." He lowered his head and thought, then quickly said, "What do I need to do?" Professor Lely said, "Grab the torch, and when the time comes, light the flame and throw it into the first brazier." Just as he finished speaking, a cool breeze blew by and twirled around his ear. Her face changed and she hurriedly said, "I should go to the other side to take my place. Sarah is already scolding me. Just grab the torch and you'll know everything. Let me go." Before Dake could say anything, she had already drilled her head into the wall and her little but disappeared. "What time?" Dake shut his mouth and rolled his eyes. He then looked at the torch in the brazier and strode forward. Fortunately, with the help of Professor Lely, he immediately escaped the stage. It didn't take him much time to get here from the banquet hall. There was still more than 15 minutes until midnight. But looking at Professor Lely's expression, he estimated that there wasn't much time left. Moreover, there were still many unanswered questions. I have to hurry, he thought in his heart and reached out to grab the torch. Unexpectedly, his fingers didn't feel cold. Instead, there was a warm feeling that spread throughout his body. Suddenly, a trace of thought entered his mind. He suddenly closed his eyes and an extremely large composition suddenly appeared in his mind. Dake finally understood what it meant to grab the torch and you'll know. His perspective infinitely rose, as if he was ascending to the sky and overlooking the ground. Countless bronze braziers were neatly arranged in a long line that seemed to stretch for thousands of miles. There were 6 of these long lines, extending straight from 6 directions and finally converging in the center. It was like a group of dragons gathering at the head. A giant bronze hall stood in the middle, magnificent and magnificent. Dake's heart suddenly surged. He finally felt a sense of grandeur that he was participating in an epic event. The area of the entire ceremony was far larger than the size of the castle. It was impossible to imagine that this was located in the castle's secret passage. The secret passage was supposed to be winding, but each bronze dragon was so straight that it was shocking. He didn't know what kind of method was used to change the world. Compared to Professor Ka-Zayer's small experiment, the Moon God ceremony and the Demon King ceremony from before were not worth mentioning. But when he thought of the purpose of this experiment, he felt that it should be on such a scale to match it. Dake glanced sideways in his mind and looked at the heads of the 6 long lines. A strange feeling suddenly rose. His vision instantly zoomed in, and the professors in the other positions were close at hand. You're here, Professor Shi Erfu said softly with a serious expression. The other professors didn't look relaxed either. Obviously, it wasn't as easy as it seemed to be to push the whole ceremony to this step. Dake couldn't help but feel regretful that he wasn't qualified to participate in all of this. But he didn't forget to nod in response. He quickly asked, "When do we light the fire? How do we light it?" Professor Shi Erfu quickly said, "Use blood as the fuel and magic power as the fire. There are about 3 to 5 minutes before the time is up. Ka-Zayer will send a voice transmission when the time is up." Then she added, "Hold the torch tightly. Don't light it." Dake was about to respond, when Sister Kalyen reminded him, "You can also light the fire with a magic fairy that can control fire, such as the 9-tailed fox." She was referring to the 9-tailed fox. But Dake replied, "I know how to condense fire with magic power." Sister Kalyen said, "That's good." Although Dake's research on magic fire was still stuck at the first chapter, magic fire, condensing fire with magic power was only the most basic of the basics. He had mastered it from the very beginning. However, this using blood as fuel made him hesitate a little. Originally, he didn't think too much about his own blood. But after learning that the special demons all required White's blood to cultivate, he finally realized that blood couldn't be used carelessly. Although his Demon King bloodline awakening was still at 0%, he knew very well that his blood had been contaminated. Although this contamination could be caused purely by the Great Sin, and not by the Demon King bloodline, he couldn't verify it at all. In short, he enjoyed the benefits of the rapid growth of his magic power, and he couldn't ignore the source of this phenomenon. Also, he habitually added saliva to the magic refinement. In fact, it was no different from White adding blood to the magic refinement. After all, saliva and blood were both bodily fluids. His blood was so special. If he used it as the fuel to light the torch, would it negatively affect the entire ritual? It would be fine if the ritual failed completely, but he was afraid that if it didn't succeed, the heart of God would resurrect into an irrational monster. His thoughts surged as he thought quickly and asked, "Why use blood as fuel?" The professors glanced at him. This time, it was Professor Pawa-Cheong-Si who explained. Although Professor Pawa-Cheong-Si was the dean of the Night Academy, she didn't participate in the recent events other than entering the underground city with him. But she was clearly one of the insiders. She said, "Blood represents oneself and connects us closely to the God that is about to be resurrected. Once the ritual succeeds, you and I will become the shackles that bind the God. Look at this copper basin that stretches for thousands of miles. What does it look like?" Dake's heart suddenly trembled. He looked down. The formation on the ground that looked like 6 dragons suddenly changed. In his eyes, it became 6 copper chains that bound the god. At this moment, he suddenly saw the light. If he wanted to resurrect the god, he had to first bind it. Only the shackled god was their god. He didn't realize such a simple train of thought until it was exposed. Then he immediately realized that the people who were guarding the 6 shackles were all extraordinary. Professor Shi Erfu was a mixed-blood elf who could control the wind elves. Professor Midya was a pure-blood human who had the eyes of the stars. Professor Pawa Cheong-si was a mixed blood with the blood of the giant royal family. Professor Li Li was a pure-blood fairy. As for Sister Ka-lien, since she could be here, she couldn't be an ordinary human. Maybe her excommunication had something to do with her bloodline. Moreover, Professor Ka-zair, who was guarding the ritual, was a mixed-blood goblin who could see the truth. Among so many bloodlines, it shouldn't be strange for a small, unawakened demon god to be mixed in, right? Dake thought quietly. The professors allowed him to participate in this ritual, which was equivalent to giving him the right to control the god that was about to be resurrected. Originally, Professor Nini, who had the Royal Orc Professor, was also suitable for this position. But Professor Nini wasn't so reliable. Well, this obviously showed that the professors approved of him. And from the perspective of benefits, this allocation of the quota was equivalent to further tying the Duke's Mansion and the Shang Malian Academy together. Of course, only the adults care about benefits. We kids only care about our feelings. Chapter 745. The speed of communication was extremely fast, while the flow of time was relatively slow. It had only been less than a minute since Professor Li Li went through the wall and Dake grabbed the torch. When Dake was slightly enlightened, a pitiful and unloved little head finally popped out from the only empty spot. Hey! Professor Li Li occupied the last spot and finally appeared on the platform of communication. Then Dake ignored her and looked at the huge hall in the center of the ceremony. His vision instantly zoomed in, and the structure of the hall and the scene inside clearly appeared. The entire huge hall was made of bronze, and its height alone was more than 10 meters, not to mention the size of the hall. Its overall appearance was like a huge hexagonal altar. There was only one level from top to bottom, and it was supported by a central copper pillar, 6 pointed copper pillars, and countless slender copper pillars. Just like the bronze brazier, these bronze pillars were also carved with exquisite mural-like patterns. But the difference was that the patterns on each bronze pillar were connected, as if they were narrating a story. Phew! He remembered the website. Vipkanchu. VIP. When Dake was about to indulge in it, he suddenly took a deep breath and broke free. Obviously, it was not the time to observe these murals. But in this extremely short period of indulgence, he still faintly felt that each bronze pillar could be used as a medium for a single ceremony. And with so many bronze pillars in front of him, it formed an unbelievably large-scale recombination ceremony. As the leader of the ceremony, Professor Ka-zair was standing at the top of the bronze hall, in the middle of a circular sunken basin. Although it was called a basin, it was actually a structure that looked like a round basin. And Professor Ka-zair was at the bottom of this round basin. Beside him was the head maid of the Ares Palace maid group, Olga Dimming. The head maid, who was given the surname Dimming, was still dressed like a maid, but in this ceremony, her importance was only second to Professor Ka-zair. In front of the two of them stood a pillar that was about 1 meter tall. This pillar was made up of 6 intertwined copper pipes that extended from 6 different directions. The bottom was like a tree root, and the top was like a claw. A gigantic heart was floating above the pillar. Bang! 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 When their eyes met, the slow and heavy sound of a heartbeat suddenly entered their ears. A familiar roar sounded in their minds, and their hearts beat in sync, as if they were about to drill out of their bodies. Dake instinctively clutched his heart and quickly steadied his mind to resist the mental influence. Ever since that time in the underground city, he had finally seen this gigantic heart again. Furthermore, this heart was not a projection, but an actual body. Professor Ka-zair, you found the heart's main body. Although Dake had some guesses, he was still shocked when he saw it with his own eyes. Previously, they had seen the heart of God in the hidden space on the 99th floor of the dungeon. However, what he saw back then was only a projection based on the mechanism of the hidden space. The real heart of God was actually hidden in the depths of the dungeon. Now, Professor Kazair had successfully traced the source of the heart of God through the projection and found the actual body of the heart of God. He had even brought it out of the dungeon. The real God's heart in front of him was still very well preserved, but it was surrounded by rings made of countless runes. These runes covered its aura, making it impossible for the outside world to detect the divinity emitted by the God's heart. At this moment, Professor Kazair was still whispering to Olga, quickly exchanging their opinions. Both of them looked very serious, but if one looked closely, they would be able to see the excitement hidden deep in their eyes. No one could not be excited. Once this ceremony was successful, they would be recorded in the history books. Dake once again focused his mind and listened to Professor Lili chatter on about the ceremony. Dake was not an important participant in this ceremony. The inside and outside of the ceremony were too profound for him. Right now, he was like a human standing beside a giant. All he wanted was to increase his knowledge. However, if he persevered in his studies, there would be a day when he would have the ability to lead a ceremony of this scale. While he was excited, Dake suddenly thought of something and asked, "Professor, who is the god that this heart belongs to?" With the caution of the professors, since they were already conducting the resurrection ceremony, it was impossible for them to not know who the heart of God belonged to. Previously, because of the need to keep it a secret, Dake suppressed his curiosity and did not ask. Now that he was fully involved, it was reasonable for him to casually ask. "It's the God of wisdom." As expected, Professor Li did not have the slightest sense of secrecy and blurted it out. It was because he knew that she was such a person that Dake did not ask before. However, so it really is the God of wisdom? This was very consistent with his guess. Just the aura emitted by the heart could make the demons in the underground regain their memories and awaken themselves. It was not difficult to guess who it belonged to. The God of wisdom was the most likely choice among them. The other choices were probably the God of life, the God of death, the God of creation, and so on. However, since Professor Lili said so, it must be the God of wisdom. If it's the God of wisdom, it's very compatible with the Academy. He thought in his heart and said it out loud in this mental communication. Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "The future is really the era of the God's revival. We must have our own God. The God of wisdom's authority has always been high. If we can obtain the protection of the God of wisdom, we should be able to provide enough protection for the Academy. Of course, this is just a conservative way of thinking." Dake smiled slightly and said, "Do you know which God of wisdom it is? The cycle of reincarnation was changeable. This world had gone through many eras. Even the so-called gods were repeatedly falling and awakening. Among them, there were many gods who had similar authority and had similar god names. For example, there were more than 100 owners of the God of Wisdom's godly name. Between the gods, there was naturally a hierarchy between the gods. Therefore, it was very important to know which God of Wisdom it was. However, this time, Professor Shi Erfu just shook his head and said, "I can't be sure for now." Dake asked curiously, "Even Professor Ka Zaire can't see through it?" Professor Shi Erfu chuckled and said, "Ka Zaire is not a god." Dake then turned to Professor Midya and asked, "What about Professor Midya?" Professor Midya Bartholomew smiled and said, "It's something that can be revealed soon. Why take the risk?" "That's true." Dake nodded and continued to listen. "Get ready." All of a sudden, a monotonous voice was transmitted into the minds of everyone present. Everyone's thoughts stopped for a moment. Then, they opened their eyes and looked at the torches in their hands. The most important part of the ritual was about to begin. In the bronze hall, Professor Ka Zaire held a magic wand in one hand and several magic cards in the other. His Eye of Truth had already been activated. He reached out his hand and the magic wand in his hand directly pierced into the pillar that held the giant heart. Beside him, Ares Ali had also taken out the golden holy garb Ares Temple armed card from her card pack. In the name of Olga Dimming. Her lips moved as she chanted quickly. The speed of her chanting was getting faster and faster. Her voice was almost continuous. Then, a terrifying aura slowly flowed out of the combat card. The Ares phantom with fluffy and curly hair came out of the card and gradually grew bigger. With a light leap, it jumped to Olga's side. The Ares phantom did not have a physical body, but when Olga reached out to touch it, it was as if she was touching a physical body. She gently patted the Ares phantom's head and pressed the combat card that was still glowing in her hand to her chest. A gentle white light suddenly bloomed. Meh. The Ares phantom softly called out and suddenly shrank. It went into Olga's chest along with the dazzling white light. A huge star map depicting the Ares constellation suddenly appeared. The star map went through her body and moved behind her. She raised her head. Her eyes under her long eyelashes were shining, exuding a sharp aura that was completely different from her usual. Even if the main ability of the golden armor Ares Temple was healing, a priest could still pick up a warhammer. The magnificent white light turned into countless silk threads. Some of them went into her body while the other wrapped around her limbs and turned into a pure white combat armor. After about 10 seconds, the combat armor was completed. Olga was wearing the Ares armor. Her long hair was flowing and her body was graceful. The war hammer in her hand was as gentle as jade. You can begin. She slowly opened her eyes. The sharpness in her eyes had completely disappeared, and her gentle temperament overflowed. Professor Ka Zaire nodded. He activated a magic card and pressed it on the back of his right hand. The light emitted from the magic card surface and imprinted on the back of his hand. Then, a steady stream of magic passed through and was branded with the emblem. The nature of the magic changed. Professor Ka Zaire controlled the changed nature of the magic and injected it into the pillar through the magic wand. Then, it was smoothly and quickly transmitted to the heart of God. The next moment, one magic array after another exploded from the heart of God at the same time. In the blink of an eye, the dense magic arrays filled the entire space. The strips of incantation that wrapped around the heart of God disappeared silently, and the divine aura was no longer restrained. It spread out like ripples in all directions. Then, before it was about to come out of the secret passage, it was blocked by layers of enchantments that Professor Midya had set up in advance. Ignite! Professor Ka Zaire's voice suddenly sounded. It was unprecedentedly serious. The moment they received the order, the professors in the 6 positions cut open their middle fingers at the same time. Bright red blood dripped onto the top of the torch. At this moment, there was no room for mistakes. Dake Diming's expression was serious, and he did the same without hesitation. He watched his blood flow out from the incision on his finger without blinking. Then, it gradually dyed the tip of the torch red. Magic surged out of his right hand that was holding the torch. It coiled around the handle of the torch to the tip. Then, the magic flames instantly rose up. Boom! The sudden appearance of the flame almost set his bangs on fire. He suddenly raised his head, and a little bit of blood dripped onto the ground. However, at this moment, the torch was completely dyed red with blood. The rising flames had already covered the bloodstains. He took the opportunity to withdraw his hand. After communicating with Professor Shi Erfu, Professor Midya, Professor Cheong Si, Professor Li Li, and Sister Kalien, he put the torch in his hand into the first bronze brazier at the same time. Boom! The black liquid in the brazier was almost instantly ignited by the torch. The rising flames leaped 2 meters high. Dake raised his back foot, but in the end, he didn't retreat. Instead, he stared straight ahead. After the first brazier was ignited, the second brazier, the third brazier, the fourth brazier, one brazier after another was ignited, and the patterns on the braziers lit up. A straight line of fire started from this end and rushed all the way to the bronze hole. This line of fire was like a fire dragon, like a chain, or like a fuse. The beginning of an era was ignited by this fuse. There was a god who was about to revive. Dake didn't know if there was a god secretly opening his eyes in a corner that humans didn't know about, but the God of Wisdom was undoubtedly the first god that was about to be revived. The previous moon goddess statue was nothing more than a small matter. Dake's gaze gradually deepened as he followed the line of fire. The darkness in front of him was completely torn apart by the burning flames, and the 6 lines of fire were approaching the altar in the center at the same speed. Above the bronze hall, complicated magic arrays of various sizes were still crazily surging out. The sound of the god's heart beating became more and more similar, and in the end, it sounded like a big bell in the secret passage. Everyone's hearts were beating at the same time as the god's heart that was completely released. As the 6 lines of fire rushed out of the darkness, they entered the bronze hall. In the bronze hall, the bronze pillars that were touched by the flames lit up one by one, and the patterns on the pillars emitted a blinding red light. The lines of fire climbed up every burning bronze pillar, turning the entire hall into a blazing furnace. Within the 6 copper pipes that were intertwined to form the pillars, the starlight of flames gradually lit up. Professor Ka-Zayer, who was holding a magic wand, had already started chanting the incantation of a spell. The incantation flew out of his mouth and condensed into something solid. It continuously drilled into the pillars and was then guided into the god's heart by the pillars. Hum! A sudden hum sounded, and the entire secret passage seemed to come alive. In the beating of the giant heart, godly music sounded. At this moment, Dake and the others were closely connected to the entire ritual. They saw the bronze hall in the center. Their hearts beat faster. Chapter 746. Looking down at the top of the palace, the giant heart of God was emitting a bloody light from the inside. The blood vessels in the heart were expanding, and the crimson flames turned into blood flowing in them. The sound of the heartbeat was getting louder and louder. It really gave people the feeling that it was going to come alive. Dake's consciousness floated above, and he could see that the consciousnesses of Professor Shi Erfu and the others had also gathered. The 6 professors huddled together, but all of them were focused on what was happening below. At this moment, their mission was complete. Now, it was up to Ka-Zayer and Olga. Olga Dimming stood in front of the Heart of God, and she was under a lot of pressure. Ever since the Heart of God came to life under the infusion of flames, it would release a terrifying godly aura every time it beat. The godly aura made it hard for her to breathe. If it weren't for the Ares Temple's golden saint armor, her mana might have been in chaos. Even if she relied on the golden saint armor to withstand the pressure, she still couldn't relax. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu VIP. Take half a step back. Professor Ka-Zayer's voice sounded, and it was calm and steady. Olga frowned and looked at him, but she didn't take a step back. Instead, she slammed the warhammer in her hand on the ground. Boom! Pure white rings of light spread out, and her body emitted a biting cold battle intent, forcefully pushing back the layers of godly aura that pressed down on her. Professor Ka-Zayer looked at her in surprise and didn't ask her to take a step back. If Olga took half a step back, the godly aura released by the Heart of God would be pushed back by him, and the pressure on her would be reduced by half. However, this was also good. If she could withstand the baptism of godly aura tonight, this servant girl from the Duke's family would be able to take another step toward the realm of Valkyrie. As for the price she couldn't bear, he would think about it when the time came. Professor Ka-Zayer didn't think too much about it. He continued to hold the magic wand in his right hand, and his left hand quickly retracted. He took out a test tube from his bag, wrapped it in mana, and handed it to Olga. Phoenix Blood Potion. After taking it, you will obtain nearly limitless magic power for 3 minutes. Olga grabbed the test tube and flicked open the cork made of sycamore wood. She then drank the blood-red liquid in the test tube. This Phoenix Blood Potion could be said to be a divine medicine. The Duke's mansion once had it, but that was many years ago. Ever since the phoenix that had protected the Dimming family for hundreds of years fell in the war, the Duke's mansion could no longer concoct the Phoenix Blood Potion. However, the Phoenix Blood Potion, provided by Professor Ka-Zayer, was made by Professor Thompson. Compared to the Phoenix blood potion of the Dimming family in the past, it was much more effective. It could permanently increase the user's mana regeneration rate. Olga drank the Phoenix blood potion in one gulp and felt as if she had swallowed a mouthful of fire. It was boiling hot, but it did not burn her flesh. The fire flowed down her throat and instantly spread to her limbs and bones. It made her blood feel as if it was boiling, and her magic power was surging. She did not know that the Phoenix blood potion had made up for the deficiency in her magic power. She only felt the surging magic power in her body and used all her strength to release the secret killing move of the golden armor, Ares Temple. The magic power in her body continuously poured into the war hammer in her hand. The pure white war hammer exploded with a strong radiance. The light attribute energy surged like a huge wave. One after another, compound magic arrays bloomed on the ground where the hammer stood. The star chart of the Ares Temple slowly rotated behind her. The illusion of a huge Ares Temple appeared, and pieces of wool fell from the sky. She raised the war hammer and tilted it forward. A white pillar of light suddenly shot out from the front of the war hammer and poured into the heart of God. There were thousands of healing methods in this world. However, there were only a few that could bring out the greatest effect on the heart of God and even allow the body to be reborn. The secret killing technique of the golden holy robe, Ares Temple, was one of them. The heart of God greedily devoured the energy transmitted from the pillar of light. The fog accumulated in the deepest part of the heart of God was also dispelled. Its heartbeat became more and more powerful, and the expanding blood vessels gradually became longer. At this moment, the entire secret passage area surrounded by the barrier seemed to have become an individual with the heart of God as the core. The energy produced by the ritual madly gathered toward the heart of God. The recovery of God had finally begun. However, this was still not the time to relax. Olga Dimming only needed to release the secret killing move with all her strength and drink a bottle of Phoenix blood potion every 3 minutes. All the other steps, including controlling the ritual, were controlled by Professor Ka Zayer alone. All the pressure was on Professor Ka Zayer. He was the only remaining master alchemist in the world. Now that he had become a professor of magic theory, he did not stop studying alchemy. Instead, he used magic engineering to further develop alchemy, creating a path that no one had ever taken before. His strength wasn't shown in the so-called combat power. Instead, it was on a deeper level that made people look up to him. Even though there were 6 other professors present at the scene. However, at this level, no one could interfere. Dake and the others held their breaths and carefully observed every detail. Even Professor Shi Erfu was observing with a learning attitude. However, the path of a magister was a path of learning. Only by constantly learning could one continue to improve. Time slowly passed by. The hour hand, minute hand, and second hand were all moving toward the highest point. Professor Ka Zayer calculated the precision of the ritual to the millisecond. He wanted to use the heart of God as the starting point to regenerate the entire God's body. In this terrifying wave of divine power and magic power, the heart of God was completely covered by the regenerated body. A complete chest appeared above the pillar. Then, the left arm. At 11:50 p.m. on December 24th, the left arm of the God finished regenerating. Olga drank the second bottle of Phoenix blood potion. Unexpectedly, although the left arm of the God was white and delicate with well-proportioned bones and flesh, it was very young and tender. Although the body of the God was very big due to its size, the so-called young and tender wasn't just in the thickness and size. However, with the complete regenerating of the God's left arm, it meant that the God of wisdom was more likely to be a humanoid god. For a god, the human and beast forms didn't mean much. However, in the eyes of humans, a humanoid god was more likely to be liked and accepted. However, it was only a left arm. The final form could be a monster with 3 heads and 6 arms, a human body, and a snake tail. Dake thought quickly and observed carefully. With the regenerating of the left arm, the vitality of the God of wisdom became more vigorous, and the regenerating speed increased instead of decreasing. However, Doc could clearly sense that Olga was starting to lose control of her ability. Obviously, at this point, she was bound by the power of this ritual. It was no longer her releasing the secret killing technique, it was the ritual that drove her to release the secret killing technique. Even if she wanted to stop, she couldn't. On the other hand, Professor Ka Zayer's position as the core was becoming more and more obvious. The entire ritual was under his control. Endless information crazily rushed into his mind as the ritual progressed. His mind sped up to the limit, and like an extremely meticulous brain machine, he processed the huge amount of information. Then, he issued new orders through his magic power and controlled the entire ritual in a complicated and indescribable way. At this moment, he was like a puppeteer who controlled countless puppets. He was more like an elegant pianist who was playing a piano piece called God's Recovery. Time passed steadily. At 11:55 p.m., more than half of the God of Wisdom's body had been regenerated. From the head to the neck, from the neck to the shoulders, from the shoulders to the arms to the abdomen, all kinds of internal organs had been regenerated. It even had a second heart. Although their appearance was similar to that of humans, their internal organization was obviously different from that of humans. However, from the regenerated body, it could be seen that this time, it was a girl whose secondary sexual characteristics hadn't fully developed yet. Why was it a girl and not a boy? Although it couldn't be seen from the Adam's apple and chest, it could be clearly seen from the organs below the abdomen. 5 more minutes. Dake thought in his mind. Olga had already drunk 3 bottles of Phoenix blood potion, and was about to drink the 4th. The effect of Phoenix blood potion was very strong, and it definitely couldn't be drunk so frequently. However, in order to complete the ritual, she needed to drink at least 5 bottles. After 5 bottles, she would be in a weakened state for a long time. However, if she could successfully get through the weakened state, her magic power recovery speed would be greatly enhanced. However, at this moment, she naturally wouldn't think about these things. At this moment, the God of Wisdom's rebirth had reached the most critical juncture. Since she had a human form, then the head was the most important part. If she wasn't careful and made a mistake during the brain regeneration, what the Academy wanted wasn't the God of Adorableness, but the God of Wisdom. In short, she had to give it her all. The atmosphere in the secret passage became more and more serious. However, as if to celebrate the revival of the gods, the divine music that was playing in the air became more and more cheerful and disturbing. Olga drank the 4th bottle of Phoenix blood potion, and guided the God of Wisdom's brain to regenerate. As the brain gradually regenerated, the God of Wisdom's face also gradually appeared. Although it was a little strange because of the appearance of the white bones, the God of Wisdom's appearance was undoubtedly very beautiful. However, looking at its age, it was indeed only 12 or 13 years old. Of course, if they were all 12 or 13 years old, some people's secondary sexual characteristics would be very inflated, while some people's gender would be hard to distinguish. The God of Wisdom's body should be the latter. I wonder if this is a fixed appearance, or it hasn't grown yet. Dake's mind couldn't help but wonder. There were very few records on whether the gods had a growth stage from infancy to old age like humans, and whether there was a concept of lifespan. If one only used human common sense to judge the gods, there would definitely be mistakes. However, a fixed appearance that hadn't grown yet was also a basis to observe how the God of Wisdom was born. Professor Ka Zayer had done extremely detailed research on the God of Wisdom, but until now, even though he was already on the path of reviving the God of Wisdom, he still couldn't prove how she came to be. To be more specific, was the heart of God a god that was sealed in the underground city in the past, or a god created by the underground city itself? If it was the former, the heart of God was used as a basis to regenerate the god's body. That would be a fixed appearance. If it was the latter, it would be considered from infancy to maturity. In other words, it would be not grown yet. In other words, by observing the development of the God of Wisdom, after her revival, they could determine whether she was a god that was revived or a god that was created. This was also very important to the Academy. While he was thinking, Olga had already drunk the 5th bottle of Phoenix blood potion. Magic surged all over her body, and her face was as red as fire. Illusory flames burned on her body, but the radiance on her warhammer didn't weaken at all. The god of wisdom's head had completely regenerated, and part of her lower body had also grown. Only her reproductive organs and legs were left. As her leg bones grew, her skin and flesh grew. 2 slender and tender beautiful legs, as well as the crystal-clear toes on her feet, quickly took shape. At 11:59, the body floating above the pillar was almost complete, leaving only the eyes that were deliberately flowing out. Although the god of wisdom's body was huge, it had perfect proportions. From Dake's point of view, even if he observed carefully, he still couldn't find any flaws. The only flaw was that although her hair had regenerated, it had no color. Although the transparent and colorless hair was dreamy, this was only the impression it gave when it was listed separately. Once it was placed in the whole body, it would be discovered that the transparent and colorless hair would give off a strange feeling, because one could clearly see the scalp. Of course, no one would have any other thoughts about this perfect body after seeing the regeneration process of the bones, blood vessels, internal organs, and flesh. Finally, Professor Zaire tapped lightly, and an illusory clock appeared in the sky. The hour hand was approaching 12, and the minute hand and second hand were also moving closer. Finishing touch, he reminded softly, and Olga immediately controlled her magic and poured it into the brain of the god of wisdom. The nerves of the eyes and eyeballs were quickly regenerated. December 25th, 12:00 p.m. The god of wisdom opened her eyes. Good morning. Collect a name for the god of wisdom. Chapter 747. Her eyes were the same color as her hair, transparent and colorless. Although her face was delicate, it was expressionless. When the 2 sides were closed, her eyes would appear lifeless and ignorant. However, in reality, the current god of wisdom had not yet gained sentience. She was still a mere shell. The entire ritual had just entered the final stage, which was also the most critical stage. In this world, an individual's life was made up of 3 parts: soul, body, and consciousness. Even an individual known as a god could not escape the scope of this concept. To a god, the soul was called the divine soul, the body was called the divine body, and the consciousness was called the divine sense. The reason why a god was a god, apart from the fact that they usually possessed great power that far exceeded that of ordinary life forms, was their mastery of the rules of heaven and earth. First website, https://m, Vipkanchu. VIP. The ability to master the rules was called the divine right, which was the authority of a god. Every god, regardless of their individual strength, size, or status, must have at least one authority. The corresponding rule of this authority might be small to the point of allowing a bald man whose hair follicles have completely necrotized to grow hair, but it must be able to change an unchangeable truth. Within the scope of the divine right, the rule mastered by a god was the correct rule. Once one could master the rule, even the weakest, most stupid, and most brutal life form could instantly cast a divine personality. The so-called divine personality was the divine status. In other words, it was a symbol of status, a sequence of ranks. Therefore, to become a god, one only needed to master at least one rule. If this rule was integrated into the soul could be upgraded to a divine soul. If this rule was integrated into the body could be upgraded to a divine body. If this rule was integrated into the consciousness, the divine sense could be upgraded to a divine sense. Once integrated with the rule, these divine souls, divine bodies, and divine senses would all obtain the same characteristic, which was the so-called immortality. As long as heaven and earth were not destroyed, the gods would not die. This was the principle. This immortality was one of the most basic characteristics of divinity. The so-called divinity referred to the characteristics that the divine souls, divine bodies, and divine senses displayed to the outside world. Everything the professors had done so far was actually to reforge the divine body of the god of wisdom. Now that the godly body had been forged, it was time for the godly soul. This was also the most complicated, important, and difficult part of the entire ritual. The core of the ritual was to reforge the divine body and use the divine body as a medium to summon the soul. This was because the God of Wisdom's divine soul was indestructible. Even though the God of Wisdom had fallen a long time ago, his divine soul had merely turned into rules and returned to the world. As long as one had enough great power, they could reassemble it. Naturally, the professors could not fabricate something out of nothing, not even in the secret passage. However, in this heart of God that was found in the underground city, there were extremely thin soul fragments. It was the power of the soul shard that allowed the bosses to regain their sense of self. The heart of God was a part of the divine body, and now that the soul fragment was used as the basis to summon the soul, it was possible to revive it. Of course, one of the three was missing. The soul fragment did not have a consciousness fragment attached to it. Therefore, the entire ritual stopped here. Even if this ritual was unprecedentedly successful, it was impossible for the God of Wisdom's messenger to return. However, this was the main reason why the professors finally decided to do this experiment. Even though they had already added 7 shackles to the God of Wisdom, including Professor Ka-Zair, out of respect for the gods, they were not arrogant enough to think that they could control a complete god. Therefore, the ideal situation was to lack one of the three. December 25th, 01:01. The next second, the God of Wisdom opened his eyes. A black tide suddenly appeared in the originally transparent and colorless eyes. In the blink of an eye, they turned pitch black. Then, a huge suction force that ordinary people could not detect was released from this pair of eyes. Those 2 eyes suddenly turned into 2 black holes. At this moment, Olga had already stopped. Her task was complete, and she could only rely on Professor Ka-Zair now. But in reality, what Professor Ka-Zair could do now was very limited. Although he had repeatedly analyzed, simulated, and experimented on today's matter, after all, it was his first time reviving a god, and he could not fully grasp the situation. At this point, he could only spread out his hands and resign himself to fate. Could the God of Wisdom successfully summon the souls and truly awaken? How many souls could he summon from heaven and earth? These were all things that could not be verified before the truth came out. Everyone present did not make a single sound. They all nervously watched the God of Wisdom lying in the air. 1 second, 2 seconds. 1 minute, 2 minutes. As time passed, the black vortex in the God of Wisdom's eyes grew bigger and bigger. Finally, a visible change appeared on her body. First, it was her hair. The originally transparent and colorless long hair that could even be seen on the scalp was now dyed with a strand of gold. That strand of gold was very prominent among the transparent hair and could be seen at a glance. Dake suddenly noticed that strand of gold. Then, in the blink of an eye, another strand of gold appeared, and then another, and another. The God of Wisdom's scalp could not be seen at all. In the blink of an eye, the God of Wisdom's hair was now completely golden. Dake's eyelids suddenly twitched. He felt that the color of this golden hair was very familiar. Then, he subconsciously looked around and thought of something. Seems like my genes are still the strongest? Boom! He did not know if his thoughts were blasphemous, but a bolt of lightning suddenly struck down from the void. That bolt of lightning directly exploded in his ears, causing everyone who was concentrating to be momentarily stunned. Dake suddenly used the God of Underworld spell, and focused his consciousness instantly. He immediately discovered that there were dense electric currents bouncing on the bronze hall, and there was a piece of black scorch mark on the ground. This bolt of lightning had actually struck the bronze hall that was used as an altar. Professor! He was horrified and quickly looked at Professor Ka-Zair. Then, he heaved a sigh of relief. Professor Ka-Zair did not seem to have expected such a phenomenon to occur. However, reviving a god was a heaven-defying act. Of course, he had prepared a trump card just in case. At that moment, a magic card that he had attached to his body was activated and counteracted part of the power of the lightning strike. Beside him, Olga was still wearing her golden holy suit. She forcefully resisted the lightning strike and activated her warhammer, releasing white light toward Ka-Zayir. The small scorch mark on Ka-Zayir's body was quickly healed. As for the God of Wisdom, he was completely unharmed. Obviously, that bolt of lightning could not harm his reborn divine body. However, all of this was just the beginning. "Protect the divine body," Professor Ka-Zayir shouted softly. He immediately reached down and took out a magic card. Then, he quickly chanted. Olga frowned slightly. She also took out a magic card and began to apply a defensive buff to her body. Her magical talent was not weak. In fact, it could even be said that she was very strong. However, there was a flaw in her magical talent. Therefore, under Yvette's guidance, she chose to specialize in the path of equipping. Most of the high-level magic cards that she had were equipping cards and various types of magic cards that could enhance and strengthen them. By the time the second bolt of lightning struck, she had already equipped herself with layers of buffs. She had also applied an extremely strong resistance to electricity. Meanwhile, Professor Ka-Zayir summoned layers of shields to protect the divine body of the God of Wisdom and the two people on the platform. After that, the second bolt of lightning struck the shield and only caused a small ripple. Then, Professor Shi Erfu appeared above the bronze hole. He quickly went into the shield and released a wind barrier. Then, the third bolt of lightning struck and was blocked by the wind barrier. Professor Midya silently appeared inside the enchantment and began to construct the spell enchantment. That bolt of lightning came so suddenly that it was impossible to guard against it. However, once the professors were prepared, it no longer showed its power. After more than a dozen bolts of lightning struck, even the outermost layer of the wind barrier could not be broken. Seeing this, the four people who were watching from the outside were just about to heave a sigh of relief. However, they suddenly saw a lightning pillar that was as thick as a water bucket suddenly struck down. It broke the first and second layer of the wind barrier from the top and only gradually disappeared after it reached the third layer. The three professors who were inside the wind barrier were extremely solemn. They continued to add and strengthen the barriers and shields. However, in the next moment, more than a dozen lightning pillars struck down at the same time and instantly engulfed the entire bronze hole. The golden lightning was so dazzling that it was impossible to see the situation inside with the naked eye. Dake was worried. He suddenly opened his Eye of Truth. The other professors also used their own methods and watched anxiously. The continuous lightning pillars lasted for a full 3 minutes before they finally dispersed. The figures of the God of Wisdom and the professors finally appeared. The white light released by the golden armor, Ares' temple, warmed the divine body of the God of Wisdom. During this period of time, only 3 layers of the dozens of barriers were left. Fortunately, no one was injured. Professor Ka-Zayir raised his head and looked at the sky. After half a minute, he finally breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "It's over." Phew! Olga was the first to exhale a long breath. The golden armor on her body instantly disintegrated, and she seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. Professor Shi Erfu reached out to support her and said with a smile, "It's all thanks to you this time." Olga shook her head and turned to look at the God of Wisdom. She said, "Let's see if it was successful first." The silver moon in Professor Midya's eyes flashed. She had been staring at the body of the God of Wisdom for a long time. Then, without waiting for Professor Ka-Zayir to say anything, she suddenly reached out and pointed. She saw a shadow on the divine body of the God of Wisdom shaking and emitting divinity. "It's done." Everyone looked at each other and smiled. They were suddenly enlightened. Not long after, Dake and the others came in a straight line through the brazier and quickly gathered around the God of Wisdom. Professor Ka-Zayir explained the current state of the God of Wisdom while looking at Dake with a smile. He said, "I know you have a method to activate the God of Wisdom's intelligence, but before we give you permission, you're not allowed to use it." Dake's expression froze, and he muttered, "Professor, do I look like someone who can't see the big picture?" Professor Ka-Zayir was delighted and said with a smile, "I'm just afraid that your hand will slip." Dake shook his head and said, "The method I came up with is only useful for the magic guide fairies." Professor Ka-Zayir said, "Have you done an elimination experiment before?" Dake froze again and could only helplessly say, "No, I haven't." "Then it's fine." Professor Ka-Zayer looked at the God of Wisdom and said, "I hope that your method will be useful for her. A God with only a body and a soul is not a complete God. This is the initial stage of research, and it's the first time we've seen a real God. Although we were lucky enough to complete the resurrection ritual, that's all. Our understanding of God is still at a very shallow stage. Now is a very good opportunity. During this time, we have to do as much in-depth research as possible and grasp more information related to gods. This is to deal with the more complicated future." Dake couldn't help but nod. He was naturally very curious about gods. In fact, he was already on the path of researching gods. Whether it was the development of the seed of the great sin or the research of the demon god, they couldn't be separated from this path. Now that he had a sample for research, it would save him a lot of detours. "Then what's next?" he asked. Professor Ka-Zayer said, "Divinity contains immortality. Once a god starts to awaken, their resurrection will be unreasonable. Now that the God of Wisdom has a god's body and soul, it's hard to guarantee that she'll use this to develop a new consciousness or absorb the dissipated divine sense and revive completely. So once there are signs of that happening, we have to strike first." "Strike first?" Dake couldn't help but frown. "Yes." Ka-Zayer's eyes were deep. "The most ideal situation is for you to open up her spiritual wisdom and create consciousness. Only in this way can she be completely under our control. After a while," he said, "so when you come back from the West, I'll assist you in a round of related experiments." Dake thought for a moment, then suddenly raised his head and asked, "Professor, you're not going to the West?" It was actually very abrupt to suddenly say such a thing in the current environment. However, Dake analyzed Professor Ka-Zayer's words and had an ominous premonition for no reason, so he couldn't help but send a message. Then he saw Professor Ka-Zayer looking at the God of Wisdom's body with a burning gaze and said matter-of-factly, "Of course, the research has just begun. How can I leave?" Dake. He fell silent because of this. Professor Shi-Erfu acutely sensed his thoughts and suddenly frowned. "What are you worried about?" See Epsilon. 3. Chapter 748. Of course, Dake couldn't voice his concerns in front of Professor Shi-Erfu. He changed the topic back to the God of Wisdom, and asked curiously, "Professor, since the God of Wisdom's divine body and divine soul have been revived, can we read her true identity?" "In theory, yes, but in practice, it's a bit difficult." Professor Ka-Zayer said slowly, "Like we said before, our understanding of the gods is very shallow, and we don't have a systematic understanding of them. Even if we flip through all the books in the library, we won't be able to understand more about the gods. We don't even know how many gods there have been in this world. Even if we know their names, it's only those with special stories or extremely high statuses." Dake frowned and said, "But she's the God of Wisdom, right?" Professor Ka-Zayer said, "The wisdom of the God of Wisdom is a general description of her authority, and there are as many types as there are stars in the sky. The same God of Wisdom could have the authority to increase the intelligence of the golden-haired monkey, or the authority to increase the intelligence of all humans. Therefore, the two gods are obviously gods with completely different levels of divinity. However," he then changed the topic and said, "Our God of Wisdom is obviously of a high status. The God of Wisdom, who could restore the memories of the demons in the underground city and awaken themselves, naturally couldn't be a god of the underground. Otherwise, the Academy wouldn't have spent so many resources to bet on her. The descriptions of the gods in the literature that could be found today were very general and chaotic. There was no systematic division. Therefore, it was impossible to simply distinguish between the strong and the weak. Even if it was the legendary god who possessed great power, it could also be an exaggeration or misinformation. Remember the website, Vipkanchu. Vias for the God of Wisdom, the ones that were confirmed to have a higher level of divinity were God of War and Wisdom Athena, one of the 12 gods of Pelopos, Mountain of the Gods, God of Moon and Wisdom Thoth, one of the main gods of Helipos, Home of the Gods, God of Fire and Wisdom Prometheus, one of the Titans, among the many gods. The most famous god of wisdom who walked the earth in the body of a young girl was Athena, the god of war and wisdom. In fact, when the god of wisdom's body was regenerated, most of the professors thought of the most famous virgin goddess. However, Athena's status was too high, so this thought just flashed through their minds. No one thought that they could control one of the 12 gods. Even Professor Zayer felt the same. Since the ceremony is completed, let's restore the secret's path. Professor Shi, he looked around and said. The professors all nodded and began to clean up. The bronze hall under their feet had been baptized by lightning. Although the outside was badly damaged, the energy inside was condensed. If they could extract it, it would obviously be an excellent material for steel and lightning. Although the bronze braziers took on a heavy responsibility, they didn't suffer too much damage and could be used again. Although the Shang Malian Academy was big, they couldn't be too extravagant and wasteful. They still had to be frugal when necessary. After the professors left, only Dake, Zayer, and Olga were left in the bronze hall. After Professor Zayer carefully observed, he waved his wand and drew a magic circle. Then, he tapped the magic circle with the tip of his wand. After the magic circle was converted by the magic circle, it flowed into the god of wisdom's body. The god of wisdom was stimulated and shrunk little by little. Soon, she was the size of a human. And some things that people couldn't help but overlook because of her huge body suddenly came to their senses. Ahem. Doc coughed lightly and took out a fantasy beast, multiform monster, from his card pack. After summoning it, he ordered it to wrap around the god of wisdom and transform it into a white dress that covered the god of wisdom. Professor Zayer didn't care about this at all. After shrinking the god of wisdom, he rested his chin on his hand and fell into deep thought. Dake stood on the side and continued to observe the god of wisdom. He didn't say anything. About half an hour later, the professors had finished collecting all the remaining ritual items in the secret passage and gathered in the bronze hall once again. Professor Zayer said, "Since the 7 of us are here, let's try the 7 soul lock spell." Dake asked, "What is the 7 soul lock spell?" Professor Zayer explained, "It's a sealing spell that is jointly cast by 7 people. The sealing contract has been planted in the god of wisdom's body during the ceremony. Focus, I'll teach you the spell." Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly focused on reciting the spell. After a few minutes, he finally remembered the spell and nodded at Professor Zayer. Professor Zayer said, "The 7 soul lock spell is a sealing spell created by ancient sorcerers to seal gods, but it's not as powerful as imagined. It has a lot of restrictions, and it's very strict on the caster. In the end, it can only seal a few low-level gods. However, we planted the sealing contract in the god of wisdom's body when she was reborn, so the sealing contract became a part of her body. Only then can we maximize the effect of the 7 soul lock spell. However, I'm not sure if it can really be sealed." After all, there were no gods to experiment on, so there was nothing they could do. The 7 soul lock spell was divided into 7 parts. Casting a single spell would have a certain degree of control, and the more people who cast it together, the stronger the effect. Let's begin. Following Professor Zayer's command, the 7 spellcasters spread out and chanted the spell at the same time. Dake carefully sensed it and found that his bloodline and magic power were activated by the spell. A mysterious feeling emerged along with the chanting of the spell. He suddenly pointed the sword with 2 fingers, and a huge amount of magic power surged out from between his fingers and poured into the god of wisdom's body. Then, the magic line turned into a golden chain in an instant. The golden light was like a flame, burning fiercely. There were a total of 7 chains, and they locked the god of wisdom's wrists, ankles, forehead, neck, and waist. As the 7 chains were formed, more and more tiny chains grew out of the 7 rings that locked the 7 parts. They crawled all over the god of wisdom's body like snakes, locking her up completely and leaving no openings for her to escape. "It's done," Professor Zayer said, and began to test the strength of the 7 soul lock spell. After a series of clanking sounds, he stopped with satisfaction and signaled everyone to release the spell. "The strength is passable. I hope it won't be used. Next, let's give her a name. Why do we have to give her a name? When Ka Zaire figures out her identity, won't we have a name? Lili asked curiously. Professor Shi Erfu looked at her like an old mother and said, "First of all, before the research is done, we need a code name to call her. We can't keep calling her the God of Wisdom. Second, even after the research is done, we need a fake name to cover it up. A real name will make it easier for people to find out more about her background. If there's no need to reveal her identity, it's best not to let anyone know about her existence." Lili nodded and said, "Hiding without revealing it, I understand." Dake suddenly understood. In terms of the research of the gods, the Shang Malian Academy chose to develop a two-pronged plan. The team led by Principal Erti was the front line, and they were conducting research in Mountain of the Gods, Pelopos. The team led by Vice Principal Shi Erfu was the back line, and they would be kept as a trump card for critical moments. It was difficult to keep the front line a secret. It was easy to keep the front line a secret. As for which line was more important, it was still uncertain. However, the progress of the back line should be far above that of the front line. "Akuya, what do you think?" Dake raised a name. Lili asked curiously, "What's Akuya?" Dake said, "The name of the god of banquets." Professor Shi Erfu looked at him and then looked at the God of Wisdom. He shook his head and said, "I feel that this name is too sloppy. Isn't there a better one?" Then Dake thought carefully and looked up. "Ergani." Professor Shi Erfu pondered and said, "What does Ergani mean?" Dake said, "Female worker. I hope that the God of Wisdom can become a diligent worker after gaining consciousness." It seemed that the Athena of this world didn't have the affectionate name, Ergani. He thought. In the next 10 minutes or so, the professors expressed their opinions without any hesitation. They listed one weird name after another, fully demonstrating their difficulty in naming. In the end, Professor Mitya made the final decision. Between Akuya and Ergani, she chose the latter. After all, being a worker was glorious, but being a retard was a retard. After finally deciding on the name, Professor Ka Zaire, who had been watching from the beginning, wiped his sweat and said, "Ergani it is. While you're away, I'll try to engrave a circuit that simulates thinking in her body. Let's call it a day. Aren't we going to celebrate?" Professor Lili blinked and asked. Professor Ka Zaire smiled and said, "No, we don't have much time." Indeed, Professor Shi Erfu turned around and said, "We'll rest for a day tomorrow and depart the day after tomorrow." Understood. Understood. After a series of responses, the group of people who had completed their greatest achievement in hundreds of years casually dispersed. There was no celebration or announcement. It was as if they had just done something as simple as eating and drinking. However, the window had been opened, and the shackles had been loosened. The wheels of time were rolling down. Dake wanted to say a few words to Olga, but before he could, his wrist was grabbed by Lili. After that, he completely lost his balance. When he regained his vision, he was already standing in front of the tower of the aristocrat house. Lili, who felt that she had done a good deed, put him down and said, "Merry Christmas. Where's my present?" "I'll give it to you tomorrow," Dake said quietly. "Okay." Lili spun in the air and suddenly disappeared like a fairy. Oh, she was a little fairy to begin with. Dake sighed deeply and walked across the bridge worriedly. Then, he was stopped by the feathered serpent at the door. Curfew time, it was time. Maybe it was because he was already half a professor, or maybe it didn't want him to be so miserable on Christmas Eve, but the feathered serpent finally let him into the tower. When he returned to the dormitory, the first thing he did was to lie on the bed. After a few minutes, he slowly stood up. Under the watchful eyes of the magic elf, he took out the Christmas present from Panduola. I wonder if she opened it? With that thought, he slowly untied the ribbon outside the gift box, revealing a square box engraved with delicate patterns. There was a metal lock on the square box, but it wasn't locked. He pried open the lock and lifted the lid. He was stunned. The Christmas present in this square box was actually a magic card. What could it be? The higher the level of a magic card, the more obvious the personalization. However, with Panduola's level, she could naturally make a high-level, semi-finished magic card. Therefore, there was still a possibility that this magic card was a high-level one. However, when he reached out to touch it, he knew that he was wrong. The magic wave of this magic card wasn't very strong. It should be of the general type. Just like the magic card he gave to Panduola. The boy and girl seemed to have chosen the same type of gift at the same time. An inexplicable sense of joy suddenly appeared in Dake's heart. He wondered if his senior would have the same feeling when she saw his gift. So, he took out the magic card and infused it with magic. As the magic flowed in, the layer of black gauze on the surface of the card faded like water, finally revealing the real picture. Dake softly chanted the usual summoning spell, and the two little people in the picture slowly materialized in the smoke-like summoning array. Melodious music gently sounded, and the little people in gorgeous dresses danced gracefully in the air like elves. So it's the music box. Dake focused his gaze and stared at the little people dancing in the air. Of the two little people, one had blonde hair and blue eyes, and the other had black hair and red eyes. Their features were very obvious. He looked at the background of the stage that flowed and changed around the little people and couldn't help but smile. At this moment, he suddenly felt that there was no better gift than this. In the tower of the Magic Academy, although it was already past 2 in the morning, Panduola Doragon was still awake. She wore pajamas and sat in bed, activating the Christmas gift given by her cute junior over and over again. Her smile was so bright that even the night couldn't hide it. It was also a magic card that could be used for general use. After activation, music would play. The little person with blonde hair and blue eyes and the little person with black hair and red eyes sat on the swing. Above them floated a ruby ring that was bigger than the little person. The faint red light reflected on their faces, making them blush and shy. The swing swayed gently, and the boy and girl gradually snuggled up to each other. Then, the boy quietly turned his head and looked at the girl's face. Kiss. If only you were more daring. The sound lingered in the air. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.